Good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. There's a lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you. I know that life outside is so hard. There's a lot of things that can tear you apart. I know the road sometimes feel lonely, but remember you're not the one and only. There's always someone there to help you, a helping hand to pull you through. There's only one thing you should do: take my hand and join the Love and Life crew.
Koinant! Good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world, and welcome to tonight's live stream. It's gonna be a cracker. Yeah, we got Big Daddy Liberty joining us, and he's waiting on the side wings to go live. Now, before we actually get into that subject, just for the record, I've had 2 videos taken down by YouTube in the last 24 hours. One being the clip of the arrest of the child at Ballito Bay, and apparently no one else has had their video taken down of exactly the same scene, but it is what it is, as I always say. And the other was some advice from our resident doctor, Philippe, on how to say no to being vaccinated by your doctor. And I find it extraordinary that advice given by a doctor in a video clip has been taken down. And let's have a look at the that takedown. Here you go. You can see the title of the video: Can you refuse to accept a vaccine injection from a doctor? South Africa. And here it says we've removed this video because it violates our community guidelines. You'll be able to view this video for 7 days, after which it'll be removed. This period allows you to review the content and decide whether you wish to submit an appeal. So there you go. You're not even allowed to suggest ways of refusing a vaccine from a doctor on YouTube. Quite incredible. The censorship is just extraordinary, I have to tell you. Okay, let's get back to the main subject. Our guest, Big Daddy Liberty. Well, tonight we're going to unwrap this fascinating character known as Big Daddy Liberty. Get to know his background, his beliefs, and his views on what is going on in South Africa today. What is going on in South Africa today? It's an absolute melting pot. It's crazy. Absolutely crazy. Right. Sihle Ngobese, best known as Big Daddy Liberty, is the head of strategic operations at the Institute of Race Relations. Sihle has nearly a decade of experience in political and strategic communications, having worked in party politics, the legislature, and government. He is an industrial sociologist and University of KwaZulu-Natal alumni, holding an honours degree in industrial, organizational, and labor studies. Sihle brings with him the BDL social media brand and is a host of the Big Liberty Show. His YouTube channel is linked below this video, so you can always go and link to that after the live stream's over. Fascinating man, as you will see. He is responsible for the production of all IRR shows, including the flagship Daily Friend Show and podcasts. Now, without any further ado, let's get Big Daddy on. Okay, we'll just try again. But before I do, I just want to notice that a couple of people have commented in the side chat, and it's a common theme. Sharon Dumanet has said, where is it? Sharon Dumanet has said, Big Daddy Liberty for President in South Africa. And Irene Shadina says the same. She says, Big Daddy for President. Okay. Let's see if we can get hold of him now. Hi, Big Daddy. Hi, are you there, Sihle? Let me try again. Seems like we're getting through. Hi, Sihle.
Hello.
How are you? You're there. Fantastic.
I see me clearly.
Absolutely, we can see you clearly.
Okay.
Now, I was just saying that quite a few people in the side chat have said, Big Daddy Liberty for President in South Africa. How's that a starting point?
Me and formal party politics are perhaps not the best of friends, but good to be on the show.
Great to have you on, mate. Okay, now, before we get into the politics and all that sort of stuff, what I'd love to know is a bit of your background, where you grew up, how you found growing up in South Africa, and all that sort of stuff. Just give us a brief overview.
Yeah, sure. Look, my name is Sihle Ngobese. I'm a Durbanite by... I was born and bred in Durban, if anything.
Hope we don't have a problem with our internet connection tonight. It looks like we are at the moment. You have to love the internet, don't you? Yeah, I'll just try and re-link with him. Okay, guys, while we just wait for Big Daddy to get back to us, let's have a look, see what's happening in the side chat, shall we? David asks, is Big Daddy a Zulu or is just residing there? He's actually brought up in South Africa, I believe, and he certainly went to the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Now, let me just get to there and try again. Okay, I'll wait for him to call me. All right, so just some people have been asking how I am. I'm fine. I'm on the 10th day of my hunger strike. You've probably noticed my cheeks are kind of. Here we go. Hi, Sihle, you're back.
All right, can you see me now?
I can see you now. What happened?
I just had to switch from my Wi-Fi to the 4G, so I hope this will be more stable.
Yeah, I hope so.
So I don't know how far you sort of got with hearing what my background is, but
I think start from the beginning.
Yeah, I was just saying I'm a Durban-born and bred Zulu man. I'm proud Zulu at that, and I'm from a part of South Africa known as KwaZulu-Natal. So I straddle. In terms of my history, I straddle both the sort of urban, peri-urban, and rural parts of KZN. I was raised in a township called Mlazi by my single-parent mother, who was a physically handicapped woman. And I also enjoyed stints of growing up in rural parts of KZN, in just outside the Underberg and near Stanger, a place called Emapumulo, which is...
I love that area. I love the Underberg area. It's beautiful.
Absolutely beautiful part of the world. You cannot beat it. And
yeah.
You know, with the...
Sorry guys, we're having our little internet issues here. I'm sure it's going to come back. Oh gosh. Okay. Let's just give this a second. Just for the record, we actually had a chat earlier and it worked perfectly. There was no issues at all. So it's.
I have no idea what's going on. We literally had this working perfectly before.
We did.
It feels like South Africa's commies were like, he's going to be on that Loving Life show. Let's just yeah.
Conspiracy. Yeah, carry on.
This should be stable. It really should be more stable. I've done everything I can. So, yeah, I don't know where you last left it, but look.
Underberg.
Durban, Underberg, beautiful part of the world.
Yeah.
Whether you're there in winter, as I was saying, and as the snow falls, or you're there in summer, it's unbeatable. The sort of fauna and flora that this country offers us as its natives who live in this part of the world.
Right.
Including those of us who are in the diaspora, you know, whether you've left the country, you know, you can't forget, you know, where you come from and how beautiful this country can be and should be if it was properly governed.
Yeah. Now, are you there, Sihle?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm hoping you can see me and hear me.
Yeah, we can. Now, tell me about your work at the Institute of Race Relations.
Yeah, sure. So the Institute of Race Relations, as most of your viewers may know, is South Africa's oldest classically liberal organization. It was around fighting colonial rule and the arbitrary concentration of power that represented in South Africa. It was around fighting apartheid, and again, the arbitrary concentration of power that also represented, and to this day, it exists to fight this current government with its arbitrary concentration of power, with the argument being that surely, South Africa can do much better. South Africa can and should be a property-owning, free society that is incredibly prosperous and, most importantly, non-racial. This is the central argument of what the Institute of Race Relations, or the IRR, have fought in their 90-year plus history. So I'm more than proud to be a part of an institution like that. I have, I'm the head of strategic operations there, which is just a fancy title, really. What I really do is, the Big Daddy Liberty show, Big Daddy Liberty. That's essentially what I'm there to do. And the beautiful thing about the IRR is that it always tries to assist, promote, and push out, if you will, young classical liberals like me and other South Africans who work in that office. So that's what I do there. I basically, and I think quite importantly for your viewers, because there is a bit of a misconception sometimes, because most people experience me through this work, right, which just me sort of being a YouTuber, vlogger, etc. But that's only about a quarter, maybe half of what I do. The other half is me literally traveling the length and the breadth of this country to fight what we call the battle of ideas. What is the battle of ideas? Well, the battle of ideas, in brief summation, is the idea that any society that is at the cusp of crisis, like we are, and indeed in the cusp of collapse, it is those who inject the most volume of ideas into that society that can change that society. So right now, as a good example, I am working tirelessly, both in terms of my air war, which is this, sort of YouTubing and, the radio shows that I do during the week, and my ground war. Like any army, I have an air war and a ground war. And the ground war is me traveling into communities across this country, whether it's an informal settlement in the middle of Cape Town, Khayelitsha, to rural parts of the Northern Cape, to a township here, or a suburb rather here in Durban. I literally travel the length and the breadth of this country, talking to South Africans and sharing with them the ideas that create what I just described as being a free, prosperous, and a property-owning society that is incredibly, which we've never seen in this country, non-racial. So that's what I do. So whenever I ask people for support, for example, on my shows, I don't know how many people watch my show, and I say, find me on Patreon or whatever the case may be, it's basically to fund that component. Being able to put diesel in the bakkie and to get around to these informal settlements, townships, and suburban parts of South Africa to reach people and prosecute the battle of ideas.
Fantastic. Now, I just want to address the side chat and people watching. We've got over 500 people watching at the moment, just for the record.
Fantastic.
If
everybody.
If you just put your questions into the side chat for Big Daddy, and I'll answer them later, because we've got a whole lot of stuff we're going to be discussing before we get to your questions. But you can put your questions anytime, and they'll be answered later. Now, I want to start off with I think it's the elephant in the room, Sihle, and that's what happened to the Rainbow Nation and we the people under this ANC government.
Absolutely. That is a beautiful question because, as I mentioned in the promo that we did, if you want to understand the political reality of South Africa, and if you want to understand it in a truly untainted, if I can use that expression, and I'll explain why I use that word.
Right.
In an untainted way, then you've got to understand essentially the history of the ANC to a large extent. Here's an organization that was founded, in 1912 as really a collection of largely sort of middle class black conservative individuals, guys who were very well educated. I mean, if you look at the founding fathers, if you will, of the ANC, these were like lawyers and doctors and professionals, if you will. And the central message they were trying to prosecute, if you will, back then in 1912 against the colonial government was, hey, give us equal rights. Let South Africa be like any other modern functional society where all citizens have equal rights. And under that guise, we roll out things like a quality education, a strong market economy, all the things that make a functional modern state. They were calling for that back then. Now, for a lot of people listening, they're probably thinking, oh, hang on, I don't know that ANC. I know this current iteration, which is a, socialist, communist...
it's a gangster state.
Absolutely, but one has to understand the history. And I'll spend 2 minutes just going through it and gloss over it.
Go ahead.
I usually speak to my tour around the country so that people understand where things went wrong in particular.
Right.
That original ANC of mostly intellectuals, black conservatives, rightly asking for a society which is non-racial and which recognizes the rights of everybody and provides, really importantly, for everybody, was rebuffed by that colonial government. And this is an important element to bring out because it explains why, for example, from 1912 up until basically 1948 when Smuts lost to the Nats, and obviously then the promulgation of apartheid, it explains why the ANC shifted and basically South Africa, the country of South Africa and white South Africa back then, if you will, pushed effectively the ANC into the hands of the commies, specifically the Soviets and the East Germans. And that's where you begin to see the ideological shift in the ANC away from that black conservative, almost even market-orientated party, which would have been acceptable in today's standards like a Republican Party, if anything, into becoming this red in tooth and claw communist party that is now destroying the country today. So, again, I'm sort of hearing myself talk frenetically. I usually sort of take my time to express this timeline, but it's enough to say that from 1912 and that pinnacle moment of 1948 when, and by the way, just to sort of substantiate my point,
by the way, just take your time to explain this. Just take your time. There's no hurry.
Okay, perfect. In that case, just to maybe support my argument and my point of how moderate that 1912 going forward ANC just before basically the 50s. These were guys who were moderate, conservative, relative to what was to come, of course. And the party had passed through the 1920s and the 1930s, even suspending some of its liberation demands in pursuit of, believe it or not, Smuts' war effort in the Second World War. So again, it really speaks to if you really want to understand the ANC, you've got to understand it in its various epochs and how it's developed. So that ANC, I think, is the ANC that represented truly the aspirations of most of black South Africans in terms of being a largely conservative party, family-orientated, advocating for the rights, equal rights, by the way, of all South Africans, and really a market economy. Now, let's get to where things get messy and terrible, and why the repercussions of that are felt to this day in the most horrid of ways. Then comes 1948, and heralded Smuts' defeat, and essentially as South Africa hurtled towards apartheid, the ANC was hounded into the arms of the Soviets and the East Germans, as I said, and they would embrace and infuse the party with a much hard left ideology, particularly after the adoption in 1962 of the doctrine of what they called the National Democratic Revolution. It's very important that you remember that because it'll explain why we still have today's mess. So the doctrine of the National Democratic Revolution by the South African Communist Party, whose lobbying efforts then would see the ANC adopt this document at its conference in Morogoro. This was in 1969. So you can see now sort of in the mid-60s, late 60s, this change of the character of the ANC as it even befriends asinine parties like the South African Communist Party. It now looks to the Soviets, it looks to the East Germans, for obviously funding then, to now become this red and claw party that we now know today. In speeches across the country, in the last 2 years, I've told my audiences that the doctrine of the NDR, or the National Democratic Revolution, was based on Lenin's theory. This is Vladimir Lenin, his theory of imperialism, which claimed that this is the theory now. It claimed that the wealth of the colonial powers arose solely from the oppression and exploitation of the colonized. This is their view. From this foundation, Lenin argued that the purpose of anti-colonial revolutions must always be to dispossess the colonizer, and then, of course, red in tooth and claw commies as they are, embrace communism, as they would have us believe, failing which the colonized would never be free. This is their argument. Now, the SACP, which I've just explained, are now in partnership with the ANC.
Yes.
This is the 60s. The SACP made this theory applicable to South Africa by developing what their particular notion called the colonialism, of a special type, to mean that both the colonizer and the colonized lived together in the same country, into which, the colonizer had become permanently integrated. Now, this is their theory. But despite that integration, they would contend, the white capitalist prosperity remains solely a result of the oppression and the exploitation of the black majority. Again, for those who are joining us now, I'm going through the history of the ANC, how they mingled with the commies, and what their outlook is. This is their outlook as I'm detailing it now.
Right.
I've lost my place. As I said, despite the integration of the white capitalist, as they say, the prosperity remains solely in the hands was a result of the oppression and exploitation, as I said, of the said black majority, and indeed prolonged that poverty, and that the colonizer, despite his integration, would have to be dispossessed if the colonized were ever to be free. That's literally their doctrine of the National Democratic Revolution. And since 1969, dear viewer, right up until the last elective conference that saw Cyril Ramaphosa, the much vaunted and great Cyril Ramaphosa, the ANC has recommitted itself to that socialist communist narrative of the National Democratic Revolution. They've annually recommitted themselves up to it to this year. So, having established that history and shown how the ANC became a commie socialist organization, that explains why today South Africans literally face a situation where the ANC is almost like a hydra. It has multiple heads, each more dangerous than the other, to be honest.
Yeah.
And slaying one does nothing to alleviate the fact that the body of the beast, if you will, is driven, its heartbeat, if you will, is that communist doctrine of the National Democratic Revolution. So I hope that sort of explains the monster. Now, let me explain what it consumes in modern day South Africa and why we are the poorer for it.
Right.
Since 1994, this communist monster, which obviously wears a mask to a large extent, because it has friends all over the world who supported it in the anti-apartheid effort, right? So, and some of those friends aren't necessarily communists, so it has to wear a mask because of that, of being, market orientated and the like. But really, it's not. It's kleptocratic and communist to the extreme. Okay, the experience of the ANC today is literally underpinned by that National Democratic Revolution, where the ANC will literally roll out a program, if you will, disguised, under the mask of being progressive and, for everybody, but in real terms, designed to create a state governed by them and their vanguard, again, communist doctrine,
right.
Literally controls and subverts a society to its will. So that when you look at the ANC, they will not openly come out necessarily with, textbook 20th century communist doctrine. What they'll do is, as the SACP did, they'll modify that language to basically play into the South Africa of today. What do I mean by this? Well, let me be precise and specific. In this regard, you'll see things like, for example, a communist would argue to you, or a socialist will argue to you, that the state must control the means of production, right? I.e. factories and the like. The state should essentially...
Sounds like ECW.
There we go. But the ANC won't overtly say that. Why? Yeah. Because, like I said, the character of black South Africans is largely conservative, and black South Africans want to be like anybody else, middle class, and prosperous. They have no interest in having the state control their lives. And now, as I say this, people will probably lose their minds because they don't They don't really know this about South Africans, but I'll explain all my rationale and provide evidence. So they know that the support base doesn't necessarily want that. So what do? They cloak the language of socialism. They cloak the language of communism by basically saying, oh, no. State control of things is on behalf of the poor black majority, insofar as, even though we're saying the state doesn't control all industry, it nefariously will do it through something like black economic empowerment, which literally is a piece of law that says every business in South Africa or of a certain size needs to give 26% of its ownership to the black majority. But here's the other kicker. It's never really the black majority that benefits from that. It is that elite.
Yes.
Basically,
the black privileged.
Absolutely, the black, what I like to call the crony society. So it's this political elite, and just in the periphery of it, the friends of this elite are what you call the cronies. They become the perpetual beneficiaries of such schemes, which essentially control industry, or at the very least, the ownership of it is transferred to them. But here's the other kicker, which people need to understand, that the nuance. You'll notice that all this legislation doesn't speak, for example, it doesn't make the point of saying, no, those who are currently disadvantaged must be the beneficiaries of such. Let's for a moment presume that you support BEE, right?
Right.
That same BEE doesn't say that, no, it is the currently disadvantaged black individual who must benefit from these deals. The law basically uses race to allow for the crony grouping to be perpetual beneficiaries by basically saying historically disadvantaged blacks. Now, if I am a young South African, let's say I was born in the year 2000, that'll make me 18 this year, I would benefit from something like BEE, even though I was not even born vaguely any time near apartheid.
Right.
How does that make sense?
It doesn't.
This is the sleight of hand that you see from the ANC doctrine, which basically uses race to promulgate and to push forward the national democratic revolution, and it garners support for that communist doctrine by not presenting it as it is to people, but rather presenting what sounds like an ideal thing, BEE and affirmative action, people who are then unwitting of the communist motives behind it. So now that I've explained.
Well, I've got a whole bunch of questions coming out of that. Now, the first one I'd like to ask you is, obviously the South African Communist Party, or the SACP, have a huge influence over the ANC because it's their doctrine that is now driving the organization. Now, if we go back to 1992, did de Klerk misunderstand what the ANC represented, i.e. not a market-orientated political party, but rather a communist political party? And how influential are the South African Communist Party?
Absolutely. As to the first question on de Klerk, and really white South Africa back then, who had voted in a referendum to basically see the end of apartheid.
Yeah.
I think their miscalculation was in believing, and by the way, the miscalculation was purposeful. I'm about to enter another interesting topic here.
Go ahead.
That miscalculation was purposeful insofar as they were misled, and I'll tell you why they were misled. And a lot of what I'm about to speak to is found in Dr. Anthea Jeffrey's book. She's a colleague of mine at the Institute of Race Relations, called The People's War. Now, The People's War is absolutely critical to anybody who wants to understand those years in the run-up to our first democratic election in this country, because it details the strategy of the ANC, the communist organization that it was, which had at that point, excuse me, I just need to sneeze. Sorry.
Don't worry, I do that too.
The ANC at that point, just prior to democracy and really throughout the period of negotiation, there is a question that South Africans never asked themselves in that period as to why is South Africa becoming ever increasingly violent, even as the apartheid government was rightly, by the way, because there was no other option, making concessions, moving us towards democracy. But why was South Africa becoming so violent? Why was there so much so-called black on black violence back then? The failure to scrutinize that period has become ever increasingly lucid under Dr. Anthea Jeffrey's book, The People's War. Please buy it and read it. She details the ANC strategy. Remember, I've just described to you how the ANC is now a communist, red in tooth and claw organization, and it has friends around the world who are obviously akin to it. One of those friends were the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong to be in particular, where the ANC, led by Thabo Mbeki, a delegation, went to Vietnam. I think this was in, dates fail me, but it's in the book. A delegation went to Vietnam to learn from the Viet Cong as to what the strategy of the People's War was, which is basically a strategy, and I'll gloss over this one. I won't go into the detail because I want you to buy the book. The strategy basically was create as much violence, confusion, and essentially a PR war against the state back then, which was making these concessions, in order to confuse the moment and basically make the state say, you know what, just take it. It was basically to create that sense of, you know what, this is becoming a bit of a monster that we can't manage, even with state guns and violence, i.e. soldiers and police and the like. If you think back to that period, you'll remember a lot of what was then called the campaign of rendering things ungovernable, for instance. That wasn't a random, sporadic, development of communities back then. That was violence that was purposefully meted out by the ANC, which had been unbanned, but came back to South Africa where they recognized that they weren't the most popular organization amongst the black population. There were already other quasi-nationalist and let me actually just name them. So there's the Black Consciousness Movement, which had parties like AZAPO, the PAC, and all these organizations that literally had a bigger footprint in the in the country back then. I think you've lost.
I can see you. I'm sorry, I can hear you. So keep talking.
Okay, so I'll fix that while I talk.
Yeah.
So, the ANC, as I said, came back and realized it wasn't the biggest entity anymore. Its popularity had waned, and that there were other black organizations which were much bigger. And if they were going to go to an election, a free election, the ANC were not going to win the election. So that was the realization of the ANC when it was unbanned. The other party, of course, or the other grouping was the Inkatha Freedom Party, which was largely it was the largest, actually, black movement in the country. Millions of black nationalists who essentially supported this party, and Mangosuthu being at the helm of it. Mangosuthu being the smart, suave, sophisticated Zulu gentleman back then.
Right.
So the ANC was cognizant of this. I mean, rightly so. It's if you're doing political analysis for the ANC back then, you'd have seen the writing on the wall. So what did the ANC do? Recognizing that they weren't ready for an election, if it had been called anytime sooner, post-negotiations, they embarked on a campaign of the People's War in South Africa, where they basically stoked an environment of violence. And again, I don't have to go into the history. Those who are old enough remember that period of the sort of mid-90s, 90s up until the election. And they stoked that environment using the strategy that learned from the Vietnamese of the People's War. So if you're to understand, therefore, of why the ANC is so evil and insidious, you've got to look at in the entire picture that I've painted so far in this conversation. An organization that began to its merit as a black conservative, market-orientated type party that was thrust into the hands, unfortunately, because of the resistance they met from the colonial government, into the hands of the Soviets and the East Germans, rendering them into this, vile communist organization that they then became in the mid-50s, from the Congress of the People right through to 69, at that conference in Morogoro, right through that period where they were banned and obviously found even bigger friends in other parts of the communist world back then, including the Vietnamese, right up until the point of unbanning and then learning and then applying the strategy, as Anthony Jeffrey calls it, the People's War, and why we had that violence that we did. That violence shaped the psyche of the National Party back then in terms of how it negotiated with the ANC. It created a pressure for them, which they didn't understand the genesis of the violence. But now that I've gone through why it happened, it placed a pressure on them to make concessions that shouldn't have been made in terms of the sort of society we then became after that. So that's the failure that I sort of. I know I took a very long way to describe it, but de Klerk's leadership back then was essentially bamboozled and fooled by an ANC communist strategy of the People's War, where basically the ANC created pressure that created violence and basically stretched the then South Africa's resources to the point where we were putting out fires that shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Right.
And unfortunately, that also shaped that almost rushed sense into what democratic South Africa would look like. And no one, therefore, because of the other side of it, which I forgot to mention, which is the propaganda war that they then wage, to say, look at the nationalist government. They're killing blacks. They're selling weapons to the IFP. The IFP is killing other black individuals. We in the ANC are victims of this. We're responding to it. By the self-defense units, etc., in the townships. All of that was an absolute propaganda war that was propagated by the ANC through their strategy of the People's War. And when you then share this with people, and they look back and they go, oh my goodness, that makes sense. The pieces are fitting in place now. This was basically the ANC's strategy to destroy its black opposition in South Africa and position itself as the moral authority that should then lead the country, and it worked.
Wow. Now, while I'm addressing the side chat, do you want to try and fix your camera? I'm just going to...
sorry.
That's okay.
I was
Okay. Hi there, everybody who's watching. Those in the side chat, good to see you here. Now, we've got about 600 people watching at the moment, which is great. My guest tonight is Big Daddy Liberty. He's just trying to fix his cam. It was fine until a couple of minutes ago. Please remember to subscribe to be kept informed, and ring the bell for the updates. And I'll just go back to Big Daddy Liberty. There we are. We're back. Fantastic. We got you back.
Change batteries.
Okay. Now,
sorry, that might happen. I just need to change batteries. I have ample amounts of batteries to do this.
Not a problem. Not a problem. Now, what I want to ask you is, you were talking about how the ANC operate, and there's a very recent example which clearly exemplifies what you're talking about, and that is how the ANC only provide funding support for companies that are BEE compliant. What are your views on that?
And again, now that I've set out the history of the ANC and how they mask their socialist and communist intents behind the language of race, which is obviously very emotive in our country given our history, that then allows them to slip in insidiously and even have support for it, by the way, in some pockets of society, especially the intelligentsia. Policies like BEE and affirmative action, etc., even when the evidence of these policies, even when the evidence of these policies demonstrates that they're not helping the people who they claim to help, which is the large black population,
right,
or the black population at large. Sorry. You now have a situation where, because of the years of propaganda and essentially working in to the mainstream media, their narrative that we need race-based policies in order to address the ills of the past, and not do, as a government should do, all the other things, right, which is provide a solid education. Excuse me. Oh my goodness.
It's okay. I do it too.
So as I was setting out my example and my argument, the years of propaganda and the narrative, especially selling it to the media, who by themselves are enamored by the ANC, because you've got to remember, even from that transition period from apartheid to democracy, the ANC had established itself as the moral authority. By the days of the People's War and all these things I've described. It has that capital, if you will, with the media. Because of that, you now have a situation where no one questions how these failed policies, such as BEE and the like, which essentially have concentrated wealth and power into the hands of a very small black elite at the expense, often, of the vast majority of poor black South Africans.
Exactly.
Who tried during this crisis period of the lockdown, when suddenly the ANC said, well, we've frozen the entire economy. No one can earn a single buck. There's poverty obviously looming in the distance because of this, including with people who thought historically they were okay, right? Middle class people who never thought there would ever be the sort of state dependence that they're now becoming. Those individuals who are white have then been excluded by the ANC during this crisis period, a crisis, by the way, created by them and the lockdown, not by COVID, but by the lockdown. When they were then excluded from measures aimed at assisting businesses and the like to get back on their feet or to be supported during this period, only then did you see the mainstream media, who had supported these policies all along, suddenly go, yeah, maybe these policies aren't that great, eh?
Yeah.
It feels a little mean and vicious to exclude someone, especially if it's a lifeline like this one, on the basis of race. And suddenly people got the aha moment of what we've been saying for years around these policies, that they are inherently racist in nature and they don't support the people that they purport to support, which is the vast majority of poor black South Africans. But to come to your question, because I just had to get that out there.
Yeah.
The policies in and of themselves, whether they're being implemented under this current lockdown in South Africa or just generally in South Africa, are morally dubious and actually quite reprehensible, because again, the ANC wants you to judge these policies by their intentions and not by their outcomes. And unfortunately, the media have also played into that, of basically saying, no, but these policies in their intention are fantastic. The BEE, it's in the name, Black Economic Empowerment. But the outcomes of these policies have clearly demonstrated that they're here to create a tiny elite who then fund what Marx called the Vanguard of the Proletariat. Remember, the ANC are a communist organization,
right,
and the Politburo of the ANC follow Marxist ideology, which is there must be a small elite chosen from the working class who govern the structures, the power in society, and that elite is called the vanguard of the proletariat, as Marx called it. That vanguard, the ANC has positioned itself to be, but it's funded by this petty bourgeoisie, if you will, that is created along racial lines through policies such as BEE. So BEE was never really and never will benefit the broad society by making them richer and more prosperous. No, BEE has to make the circle, the cronies, if you remember my expression, fabulously rich, so that elite funds the vanguard that the ANC positions itself to be. So if you want to understand the insidious nature and the communist underpinnings of BEE, that in that sentence that I just gave you is exactly what it is. So BEE, generally speaking, and given my characterization of it now, was never going to be something that benefits all black South Africans or even all South Africans, period. What would the real BEE therefore be, or really economic empowerment be in this country? Firstly, it would have to be non-racial. It cannot pick winners and losers in society based on race. Right. Colonialism did that. Apartheid did that, and you cannot then have a supposed, free democratic society that does the exact same thing as the previous regimes did. You have to have a genuinely non-racial society. So economic empowerment should have been things like a solid education that empowers a kid from even, rural, former Bantustan, Transkei, to be highly educated, literate, numerate, in tune with the 21st century standards of education that are required to compete with the rest of the world, and then to allow that young person to have access to opportunity that, yes, the state could provide, but also the market in particular that it provides. That would have been the true black economic or really economic empowerment in South Africa, but instead we haven't done the hard work that requires. And what we've seen rather is the shortcut and insidious in nature, really, and nefarious of saying, no, let's just use race and basically empower a few, and then most condescendingly to black people like me, ask poor black people to live vicariously through this new created elite of blacks. That, if you want to argue what is the most disgusting and insidious parts of it, it's not necessarily what it does to white South Africans, bad as that may be, but also what it does to poor black South Africans who will never get that opportunity and who are then asked by those politicians to live through that small elite of black politicians so that they drive in our townships. As I used to live in Umlazi, you'd see these motorcades of fantastic, German sedans, and you'd ask, hey man, who's that? And how did they become so fabulously rich? And they go, oh no, they'll say that person is so and so, and he gets all the tenders from the city of Durban or the city of Joburg and whatever the case may be as a BEE beneficiary. Oh, okay. Will I ever get that opportunity? No. Oh no, they'll say you need to be in the ANC and be part of that machinery in order to be a beneficiary. What if I don't want to do that? What if I don't believe in those ideals of a socialist communist dystopia? Why should I support that in order for me to become a middle class, prosperous black individual who's family orientated? So that's the real inequality I've argued that now exists in this country. It's mostly in the black community of a large, poor, still rural to an extent, but really urbanizing black majority. And the schism created by creating the small black elite who are obviously within the circles of the political elite, and they enjoy the trappings of this new South Africa, and then every now and then throw a few food parcels, a few social grants.
But they only go to the ANC cadres anyway, those food parcels.
Well, there's the other irony of it. But again, the beautiful thing about this lockdown period is it's brought that into sharp focus for even people who were ANC zealots, who still believed in the Project ANC, if you will. It's brought the truly evil nature of the ANC into sharp focus. And I was actually saying on my other radio show that I do, that I've got a feeling that with the local government elections basically a few months away next year coming, the ANC, as has been the trend in any event in the past sort of 3-4 elections, will not only see a continuous decline in support. I mean, in the last local government elections, you've got to remember, the ANC basically lost the support of urban South Africa, including black urban South Africa. So that ever increasingly, the ANC is becoming this rural party that depends on rural support and peri-urban support to a lesser extent to stay in power. But in this instance, they didn't stay in power because they lost all the major cities. They lost Johannesburg, they lost Pretoria, they lost Nelson Mandela Bay, which is former Port Elizabeth. So again, the writing's on the wall. For a lot of people who think, oh, the ANC will never be defeated and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, you've got to actually look at the data. Number one. Number two, you've got to understand the ideology and how they've masked it in order to get black support. And number three, as black individuals become, their incomes rise slowly, which is the worst thing for the ANC. There's nothing more worse for the ANC than the black majority actually seeing a rise in income and becoming middle-class individuals, and urban in particular. The ANC has lost that support. So all indications are that post this lockdown, which is now even further brought into focus just how evil the ANC is,
right?
The ANC will not make a comeback in this election. The problem is, what alternative do people have? But that's another conversation.
Yeah. Now, my understanding is that the IRR believe that the ANC will lose the election in 2024. But let's look at the situation today. Do you think that the black masses in the townships are realizing now and talking about during this lockdown how they've been deceived by the ANC? And if so, do you think that there's a very big chance that they might rise up against the ANC itself and like burn down Luthuli House and stuff like that? Is there that much gatvol feeling within the black community?
Look, to be honest, I can answer this in two ways. both of which will be substantiated with hard evidence and data.
Right.
Nothing that I ever say or do on my show is mere invective and opinion. It's often, every time, there must be hard data behind it. So I'll answer that question in 2 minutes. As I've said already, if you look at the record of electoral history in this country, the ANC is already losing support, period. You just have to look at its results mostly in urban areas, which are, 62% of South Africa now is urban. And that's growing, by the way. So we're in a rapidly urbanizing society. And the ANC know this, by the way. It's a threat to the electoral results. Those individuals are not communists. Let me first take 2 steps back before I get to the 2 ways of answering your question. Who is the average South African? Who is the average black, white, whatever South African? Number one, they are not race obsessed. Let's get that one out the way.
Right.
South Africans, by and large, you can characterize them in 3 ways. Number one, they're God-fearing individuals. 92% of the country is Christian. And when I mention God-fearing and the religious aspect of it, it's more the values we then derive from our faith, which are common to that 92% of South Africans. Number two, they are law-abiding by and large. Most South Africans, except for those maybe when the orange turns amber and you want to beat it quickly, most South Africans don't go out of their way to break the law. We have a massive crime problem, yes, but that can always be explained, if you look at the data, by the sort of socioeconomic and drivers of crime, and of course other factors. But by and large, that isn't a majority of the country. Most South Africans are victims of that crime, whether you live in an informal settlement and you have to invest in padlocks and chains to basically close yourself in once you get home, or to, highbrow suburbia, where we literally invest in private security and the like. We are victims of the crime in this country. That is a shared experience, black and white. And the third element, which is the most important to me and how I communicate to people, is we are a family-orientated society. That one for me is the kicker. It's one that actually gets me a little emotional. So sometimes, it's one that gets me a little emotional sometimes because, whether it's that guy who pulls a trolley, weaving through South African suburbs to pick up our trash, our recyclable trash.
Right.
The poorest of the poor, whether it's a poor chap who lives on a sand dune in Cape Town in a shack, to that lady who stands by you, at the taxi rank selling fat cook and archer and whatever to patrons, or that BEE guy, entering into some high rise in Sandton. All of those individuals, Scott, are doing what they need to do for the benefit of family, period. They're not walking around with a chip on their shoulder saying, white's this or black's that. They have no interest in that. That's the political rhetoric. And remember, I said to you, there's a growing schism between what the political elites do and how they talk, and the intelligentsia that support them, and the average South African. And again, as I said when I began this sentence, I will demonstrate this with evidence. That chap, the ordinary South African who I described as God-fearing, law-abiding, and family-orientated, has no interest in the petty politics of race and the dystopian ideas of socialism. He's more interested in what can my daily lived experience, how can it continuously improve for the benefit of me and for the benefit of family. Now, that individual looks at South Africa politically and goes, especially after this lockdown period, heck, these people have prevented me now from earning the very thing that I've argued creates a better everyday for me. Whether you're an informal trader or some Fortune 500 employee, right now you're sitting at home watching politicians with their cunning grins on their face telling us how they know what's best for us, even though on a day-to-day experience, I live my life as an individual and pursue my own separate interests for my own benefit and for the benefit of family. Now they've prevented people from doing even that. It is that, Scott, which will drive the new wave of anger. It is that, Scott, when you then couple it with how people think of the 26 years of ANC rule, which will make them go, I don't think this will get any better. If we've had 26 years of this sort of incompetence, inept governance, and essentially kleptocracy, why should I believe that it'll get any better? Number one. Number two, they then look at the electoral results and go, clearly, I'm not a minority in this. There's more and more of us who believe that the ANC are pure trash. And that actually, to be honest, politicians are trash. Hashtag. And now they're thinking, who do I look to? Where do I go? And that, I fear, is the question that we haven't answered. And if you look at the data, remember I said everything I'll say will be backed by data.
Right.
There are about between 12 and 13 million South Africans in this country who are eligible to vote, but don't vote. Now, juxtapose that number of 12 million to the 10 million voters the ANC got in the last election, and you start seeing what I'm talking about. Because it can't be 12, 13 million white South Africans exclusively, because I often hear, the pushback on my social media feed. You're just saying that because you like whites and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, no. The 12, 13 million people I speak of, you can't argue. I mean, the population of South African whites is about just under 7 million now, I think. So there's clearly double that number of individuals, likely, presumably, and mostly black, who are saying none of the political parties, including the ANC, represent my wants and who I am as a South African, especially those three characteristics I described. And I'm of the view that, and the data supports this, if those 12 million ever came into the election cycle to vote, ANC would be gone like that. Like that.
Right.
Because, again, it's pure numbers. But the problem is, how do you bring those 12, 13 million people in? Who are they? What do they want? What do they want out of their politics? And I'm of the view, given the characteristics of South Africans, and this also goes against my own ideological views, but I'm of the view that these are mostly black conservative individuals who want a market economy and one which creates prosperity for families across the board, and does so in a largely non-racial manner by basically focusing on what we call enabling opportunities in economics, a solid education, good healthcare, safety and security. I think that individual who rises up in our political scene and speaks that language that resonates, if you will, with the God-fearing, law-abiding, family-oriented South African. If they speak that language, that person will be a very powerful kingmaker in our politics, because the evidence is there. This will be my last sentence. I'll bring it back to you. The evidence is there that South Africans don't necessarily want the socialist dystopia nonsense. I mean, the EFF, for all of the disproportionate coverage that they get, the EFF are the Economic Freedom Fighters, another communist iteration in this country, led by a populist loudmouth, Julius Malema. Even with all the disproportionate coverage they get as a 6% party initially, they could only muster a rise, and what now seems to be a cap of about 9-10% basically of the electorate. Now I say that and people go, oh, but that's 9-10% of like people who want communism, and I'm like, well, that kind of means there's 90% of voters out there who actually just rejected their message as the EFF being an alternative to the ANC. And also that that EFF of a 9-10% failed, like all the other parties, to attract a sizable and noticeable number of those 12 million people that I argued are eligible to vote but don't vote. So that tells you everything you need to know about the character of what South Africans really want. They don't want the socialist claptrap. What they want is that person who says, listen, let's build something special. Let's build the Australia of Africa, if you will. Shout out to my Australian fans who are watching me. Let's build that modern functional democracy that has a high level of income and a large middle class that is prosperous, that really doesn't really care what their government does because they are enjoying a high standard of living. That's what they want. Right. So I think that sort of caps my point and makes the point of what to expect and why we substantiate our point that the ANC are not going to rule until Jesus comes, as one Jacob Zuma once described the ANC.
Right. Now, I guess the point is that it's quite clear that there's a lot of anarchy starting to appear in South Africa. The police are having their vehicles burnt, they're being stoned, and this is not in white suburbs, this is in black townships. So there's a lot of black anger against the establishment and the ANC. Now, what I'd like to just look at here is when we went to the election in 1994, the new democracy, the whole mantra was a rainbow nation. Now, clearly, we all know that this is a complete farce. What I'm saying here, do you believe that the ANC went into 1994 deceitfully, knowing that there would not be a rainbow nation in South Africa?
Well, the ANC sort of perverted the definition of that, didn't they? I mean, they literally worked from day one since winning that first election in basically arguing that the Rainbow Nation is one which believes in the very same ideas of yesteryear, which is a government which now claims to be pro-black, right, and purports to be in the interests of black South Africans, but then rolls out policy to an entire nation that it now has to govern through a racial lens. Now, the biggest victory the ANC has had, if you will, is to convince a society, mainly through the chattering class, to be honest, and through their bosom buddies in the media, that the same sort of power of choosing winners and losers based on race now represents progressive ideology and now represents this idea of a rainbow nation. I mean, you could have had the Nats, from 48, when they started pushing apartheid, argue the same nonsense and say, our policy of choosing winners and losers in society based on race is also one that recognizes, the diversity of South Africa, the rainbow nations, by providing for each in their own certain way, i.e. choosing winners and losers based on race. It's the same ideology being dressed up today, with the rainbow, or rather with the bow, and being given to us as this wonderful present that demonstrates how progressive we are. It's the same trash. It's actually the same trash.
Right.
So to answer your question, you have a situation now where more South Africans just recognize that. They recognize that. Because the one thing you can't do in a society like ours is lie to people forever. Because invariably, you may push a certain lie that vilifies one person or, creates a sense of us and them. But in terms of the everyday interactions of South Africans, we learn that that stuff is not true. For instance, people of my generation, by and large, you have this rhetoric that, whites are evil and they're colonial settlers and, Indians are untrustworthy. They just want to make a quick buck, or coloreds are just drunkards, and, like all this nonsense that we inherited because of our past, right? And the sort of racial rhetoric. But now my generation kind of go, but all this is nonsense. Like, I have Indian friends at school, and Jerome, my colored friend, we play soccer together, and Justin, we sometimes go bodyboarding together, with his dad. Like, there's a very different psyche as to who we are on the ground as South Africans versus who we're being told to be by the intelligentsia, the academia, which are social justice warrior types, and of course, who are yoked to the race-obsessed commies that the ANC are at a structural power level of the state power, if you will. There's a big schism between these two, and it sometimes takes you just venturing out into the streets of South Africa, as I do on my show, by the way. And this is why I always say, I always back up what I say with evidence.
Right.
On my show, I pay a lot of attention, Scott, to doing street-level interviews, whether I go to a taxi rank or a bus stop or, some area where there's a lot of people, there's a lot of hubbub, and I yank someone from the street and I shove a mic in their face and I say, tell me what you're thinking, what's on your mind when it comes to this or that issue. And often I juxtapose what we're being told South Africans want, especially black South Africans, by the politicians and the media, with what that actual individual says about what said they want. Sorry, that sounded like a fragment error. Let me repackage that sentence properly. I will always juxtapose what we're being told by the mainstream media and by the political elites is what supposedly is what black South Africa wants, by actually talking to black South Africans, or ordinary South Africans, if you will, and saying, hey, this is what they say about you. Do you support that? For example, I have an episode on the national health insurance where I stood outside a government hospital as people were streaming in and out. And I said, hey, Is this an ideal to you? Would you want more of this? More of the politicians and the administrators and government bureaucrats controlling your healthcare? Or would you like something different that replicates what middle-class South Africans enjoy, which is private healthcare, and a higher standard of that? And the answers were absolutely crystal clear. No one wants what is being said is pro-black, the socialist communist stuff of state control in all aspects of people's lives. People want to live in a market economy. Right. This is why I keep saying to you that it will take that politician who recognizes this and can galvanize that message to basically defeat, generally speaking, the leftist gaggle in this country.
Okay, now that leads me to the next question, which is, how can we build a free, prosperous, and property-owning South Africa?
Absolutely. That is the question of the age. My work, Scott, is 100% prosecuting that battle of ideas. And this is how I'd answer that question in a minute. What you need to do now is win the battle of ideas in society by not only immersing yourself in the very places where we're told not to go. So often, in terms of my ground war that I described earlier on, if you see my bakkie anyway, I have a nice Ford Ranger bakkie, which is branded, has my effigy on it. 9 times out of 10, Scott, you will see that bakkie in South Africa's informal settlements across the country, in South Africa's townships, because that's where I do most of the work. And what I do is I talk to those people who I've argued and I've ably, I think, described as the God-fearing, law-abiding, family-orientated South African. And I say to them, what guarantees not only your high standard of living now, in your today, but for your children in particular, which are the people who you wake up for every day to do what you need to do, to provide for. And there is a basket, not a series, but a basket of ideas that I translate to them 2 steps back. So people who know me, they know me at an academic level as being a classical liberal, right? Limited government, sound money, societies which basically, where the individual is more important, and really, I talk a lot about individuals, but really we're a family society. So families are more important than bending the knee to the state, right? But it's very hard to translate these concepts in their abstract to someone, who isn't, for example, university educated and really doesn't care about that. So you've got to find a way to translate what it would mean for South Africa to be a closely more classically liberal, or if you're American, conservative type society. What does it mean to disband the power of the state? I think you've probably lost me because I can see my lens going wide, but I'll keep talking through it.
Yeah, just keep talking, that's fine.
What does it mean to disband the power and the resources of the state and place more of that into the hands of families and individuals? So you've got to be able to clearly articulate that. Often I use the enabling opportunities as my example. So remember I said to you, enabling opportunities?
Yeah.
In economics, things like healthcare, education, and safety and security. So I will talk to people in the various communities where I work by relating classically liberal ideas through those 3 topics. So, for example, on healthcare, what do you tell someone living in a shack, dependent on the local government clinic, that his healthcare would look like under a free society like my own? Number one, and it always begins here, you disband the resources and the power of the state and you disperse it to poor individuals. That's the only person that the state should focus on in terms of resource provision, because middle class people are fine. Rich South Africans are fine. There's no reason why the state should meddle in their lives, by and large, and equally, there's no reason that should meddle in poor people's lives. But I work on the basis of the type of society that we are, not the one that I want it to be, but the type of society we are. And in the kind of society that we are, there are millions of poor South Africans who need some form of hand up in order to get them to that middle class status. So what do? Health. Instead of the state saying, we're going to roll out the national health insurance, which is basically the state controlling all healthcare and nationalizing even private healthcare, and then deciding, who gets what healthcare, where and why, how about we break up the power of the state, break up the budget that the government spends, let's say, on healthcare, privatize all hospitals, and then the budget that they were going to spend on the upkeep of state hospitals, break it up into vouchers for families. And we've calculated that you could, on average, for instance, and again, it's a rough calculation, it hasn't been cost accounted in full terms. On average, you could give a family about 14,000 Rand per person per year. Now, that's enough to buy you in South Africa right now a sort of basic entry-level type health insurance that allows you to have not only a hospital plan, but also a bit in the way of hospital savings. So now you literally empower the family, especially the poor family, for them with that capital in the form of vouchers, of course, or in some form of insurance, which is governed by the private sector, for them to use that capital to go shop around for the health insurance that would literally meet their needs as individuals and families. Now, you've bypassed a whole group of cronies who literally have fed off of the system because it was initially dispensed by the state. And what you've done now is you've placed the resources and effectively the freedom to choose into the hands of individuals. Now, I can tell you this, whenever I share this, amongst other ideas, with ordinary plattelandse gewone mense types, they literally freak out because they go, whoa, I didn't know you could do that. I always thought that you needed to go through the politician, and sort of bend the knee to him and deferentially say, oh, great politician, please provide
Master.
my food basket, but also my health care. And, does it please the crown if I start a small business on the side so I can supplement what you give me as the state? Now they listen to me and they go, heck, that's doable. That's actually doable. The infrastructure exists, right? And all you're doing is you're reallocating where the money goes in order to bypass the greedy hands, the corrupt in essence, inept, and you're putting it in the hands of individuals and really families. And trust you me, as I said to you, families will do anything for the benefit of theirs and their kind, if you will, for them to prosper. And if I gave a poor mama from Alexandra Township, just quite close to me now because I'm in Johannesburg, if I gave her in the form of a voucher that she can redeem at any insurer that she shops around with, between 14 and 15,000 Rand per person in her family, you bet your bottom dollar she will literally scrimp and look around for the best deal that she can get for her voucher, so that her family and her are covered with health insurance like every other middle class individual in this country, and that she would no longer be dependent on that terrible, shoddy healthcare system that currently exists and will be exacerbated by something like a national health insurance, as is being proposed by government. I do the same thing on education. This will be my last example. I do the same thing on education because they ask me, but no, what do we do about the poor, underperforming black township school, right? Or the rural school? Surely, surely we need the government for that kind of crap. And I say, no. The same principle applies of taking the power and the resources away from the politician, away from the bureaucrat, and placing it into the hands of South African families, particularly poor families. Again, you don't have to necessarily meddle with middle-class South Africa. We're fine, by and large. We can still afford to do what we need to do to buy the services that we want. What you're doing is extending that same privilege and right, if you will, if you want to be lefty about it, but really a privilege, to the rest of society who can't afford that. So what do you do on education? Same principle. This government in this country spends the most, outside of the military, it spends the most on education in South Africa as a function of its GDP. But the outcomes are terribly poor. Why? Because the supply side of what we're doing in education and the demand side don't match. What do I mean by this, Big Daddy? Well, let me be precise and specific. In education, you could do the same thing. You could break down the, 460 billion Rand that we spend on education into education vouchers. And we've worked out that, again, rough calculation, in this instance, I can give a family per child between 16 and 22,000 Rand a year for them to dispense on the education of their child. You mean to tell me if I created a class, if you will, of poor black South Africans who have cash in hand, voucher, but cash in hand nonetheless, to the value of 22,000 Rand, that there wouldn't be a springing of quality private schools to try and meet and capture those vouchers? By God, we're seeing it right now. Insofar as innovative private schools like the Spark schools here in Johannesburg and in other parts of the country, which are private schools but are rather more affordable options, and they provide a better quality of education than the government schools. And I'm saying, as the classical liberal, extend that same privilege, that same freedom, if you will, onto the poor individual by basically breaking up the state's monopoly and power and resources and placing those into the hands of poor South Africans, so that essentially, as a form of a hand up, you're raising the education level, you're raising the quality of healthcare they receive, you're raising the safety and security. I'll speak to that in another segment. And over time, you're creating a population of people who are well educated, healthy, safe, and who are able to then move into that middle income bracket and become a larger middle class in South Africa. That's how I beat, in terms of the battle of ideas, the idea that the state must control everything. Those are my ideas, my weapons of fighting the idea of a centralized government controls everything state. So that's what I do. I travel the country, and just watch my channel to see exactly what I'm talking about. I'm always somewhere out and about. And I preach this, I prosecute these ideas in these communities, injecting them, because we're at the point of crisis, as I said. And remember what I said about the battle of ideas. It is he who injects the biggest volume of ideas into a society at the point of crisis who will change that society. So that is what I've given up my life, my former professional life, to devote my life to doing this to save South Africa.
Fantastic. Look, I have got so many questions for you, so we'll get into those in a second. And I just want to address the side chat and just say thanks, guys. We've had a huge audience here tonight. We had up to about 650 at one time, just for your information. Now, I think we need to have another live stream because there's so many other questions I want to ask you. I mean, I'll tell you two of them, but I need to get to the questions in the side chat, otherwise we'll never get to them. One of them is the expropriation of land without compensation. The other is, what is it with these big queues and crowded taxis? How can a lockdown ever work? I mean, clearly it can't. But I do have one final subject I want to discuss with you, and it's something that just happened yesterday. And it's that child that was arrested at Ballito Bay. Now, when I put that video up on my Loving Life 2020 channel yesterday morning at about 7 p.m. your time, by 10 p.m. YouTube had taken it down. Can you believe it? They took the video down. And everybody else has put it up, including yourself. They've left them up. I just wonder what the heck is going on with YouTube. Let's just talk about that incident at Ballito Bay. Are the police and traffic police actions overtly against minorities, or is their level of training inadequate? What do you think is actually behind this?
Two things. I don't think it's a matter of them picking on minorities. I think what you have in this situation is a poorly trained police force, period, across the country. Maybe save for places like the Western Cape, but they have their own examples of shoddy policing, both at a municipal and South African police service level. What you have is poorly trained individuals who have just been empowered, Scott, with almost carte blanche powers to harass and intimidate and boss South Africans around. And I'm doing a little compilation now of just how disgusting the behavior has been from the security force, now effectively resembling what we saw in the heydays of apartheid, where you have the specter. If you're a township resident today and you're old enough to remember the days of apartheid, to you waking up and standing at your fence looking out almost looks no different. The color of the soldiers may have changed, but it's almost no different, because there's literally brown shirts marching up and down your street, and the South African police service harassing and doing things like shouting into people's yards, "Go back inside, how dare you stand in the yard of your property." Facts. These are things that are actually happening, and I'll share content of it in this week's episode of the Big Daddy Liberty Show, where I ask the question, is it wise for any society to concentrate that amount of power and the threat? Remember, state power always comes with the threat of violence.
Yeah.
Any government law that is promulgated anywhere in the world, by the way, comes with the threat of violence. So you don't pay taxes are taken from you, because if you don't pay them, or if they don't take them from you for whatever reason, there will be men at your door with guns to demand that money. And of course, with the threat of locking you up. And that principle applies to any law that is then promulgated. Now, multiply that, amplify that by a politician who then says, we're going to suspend the sort of normal rule of law in the country and institute this thing that we call a state of disaster. And under that, we centralize more and more power into the hands of the small elite. Remember, the vanguard of the proletariat. That's always how the ANC thinks. The small elite, who we now call the National Coronavirus Command Council, made up of a small elite of politicians from the cabinet who have almost unfettered powers under Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and the president of the republic, to a large extent, who are de facto continuing their war, so to speak, that they started at the last elective conference, where Ramaphosa won ahead of Dlamini Zuma. So we're just seeing a continuation of that. But this time, the camps behind them are dangerous camps, because behind Dlamini Zuma are the securocrats, the ones who see the state as a vehicle of
oppression,
if you will, and in order to get what you want, you must enforce it through the will, or rather through the use of state guns pointed at people. So those securocrats, led by the likes of Dlamini Zuma and Bheki Cele, who's the Minister of Police, are very happy at the moment at this concentration of power that the state of disaster has accorded them. And behind them, recognizing their opportunity in this crisis, are the overtly commie types, the sort of red in tooth and claw communists, the likes of Ibrahim Patel, who's from the South African Communist Party and has been made the Minister of Trade and Industry, basically hiding behind the securocrats to say, you guys, scare them and bend them to our will, whilst we roll out as much as possible and as quickly as possible all these socialist and overtly communist diktats, which empower the state more and reduce the power of the individual and the family, really. So that's why a lot of these asinine regulations that came with this declaration of a disaster are being driven from. It's ideology, not addressing COVID, not fighting the disease, but actual ideology. And then you have the other camp. So I said the securocrats and the commies who hide behind them in order to use the opportunity to enact the ideals.
Right.
Then you have the other side, which is naive to a large extent. It's actually trying to do what they stated they're doing, which is to fight COVID and the like. So they're led by people like the President Cyril Ramaphosa and his cronies that supported him, like Sihle Ngobese, etc., who's the Minister of Health. Now, just to give them a little bit of credit, someone like Sihle Ngobese, the Minister of Health, is legitimately trying to fight COVID, right? So, and if you look at it, he's the more affable face of government at the moment, in terms of saying, hey guys, I'm trying to be transparent, here are the latest numbers, here are what we're doing. But he is also a victim, if you will, of the securocrats, who are basically saying, yes, you do what you have to do on that side, but we're going to do what we want to do now. And hey, it so happens to happen at the same time as Corona, but really, we don't give a flying fudge. This is about us putting in place the sort of structures and limiting the sort of liberties that we need to limit at this point, so that people never get those rights back, people never get those freedoms back once we've defeated COVID, so to speak. And I made this point at the beginning when they started mentioning this whole lockdown farce, and I said, understand this about government, period. Once a politician gets a whiff and a sniff of almost unfettered amounts of power that they don't ordinarily have, once they're able to limit liberties and rights, yes, under the guise of it being temporary and on the basis of some emergency, once that emergency elapses, once that temporary period elapses, trust you me, they will literally enact, or rather, they will never relinquish those powers. And there have been things that have been rolled out by the state, including surveillance of citizens, by co-opting cell phone companies, including, normalizing the presence of a rough Skopskiet and Donor type policing that we last saw under apartheid. They've brought that back. And what makes it scary for me as a freedom-loving individual is that there is a group of this chattering classes who are safely ensconced, by the way, behind the wall of the army, behind the wall of policing, who are now goading this on and clapping for it because it's not happening to them, right? It's happening to those other people, those people in the townships, those poor people in settlements. How dare those people not social distance, even though the reality of where they live, just it's impractical to expect them to social distance. How do you ask someone who lives in a 4x4 shack,
you can't,
with, let's say 6 other people there,
you can't social
for
distance.
him to social?
You can't.
Again, Scott, it underpins the idea that this lockdown initially they didn't even think about poor people, had nothing to do about them. But they were thinking, oh, goody, here's an opportunity to do something, to go after those petty bourgeoisie types, because we're commies. We need to subvert quote unquote white monopoly capital using all this power. And nobody even thought about poor people and the practicality of a lockdown for them. That is why it has been those people who have been on the receiving end of most of the violence from the state. And even those of us who are in the middle class, as was the case with this example, for example, in Balito, middle class individuals, behind our high walls on our private property, who initially thought, okay, this will never come to us because we're doing what's right. We're behind our private properties, we're socially distancing and blah, blah, blah. But we forgot, even though there were people like me telling you not to forget, that violence that so far had been in the townships will eventually make its way to you, because that is the nature of the state. The state literally goes after individuals who it views, for whatever reason, right, for whatever ideological reason, it views as being a threat to the politicians of the day. So to come back to that video of the Balito father who desperately fights off those two goons from the state, as I call them in my video, Officer Ham and Constable Bacon, he literally, and by the way, I found out a bit more. These are two municipal police officers of the KwaDukuza municipality, which is where Balito falls under. He literally fought these two guys off. And you could see the abuse of power in that. It has nothing to do fair. To be fair, it really didn't have anything to do with his race. What you actually saw there is an empowered state official thinking he's above everybody else, saying, "Oh, so you don't want to bend to my will? Then let me just grab your child." And what's the word? Sorry, I thought of the sentence in Zulu. Literally showboat that you're nothing to me. I'm empowered by, the state, and I'm backed by guns. And I can do as I please here, even if it's not even within the rule of law, because really we've suspended the rule of law and we're acting under the diktat of politicians who have centralized power. And told us that we are allowed to enforce their will, not the Constitution, their will. Now, if any of you have read Animal Farm by George Orwell, you literally see this
fabulous book.
The pack of dogs enacting the will of the pigs, who had basically said they are more equal than others.
Now, I'm going to turn to the questions. We got a bunch here, so perhaps keep the answers fairly short. Otherwise, we just won't get through them.
And my battery will probably run out, and it'll be total darkness and just voice only. But let's answer the questions.
Okay. Lucy Lockett has asked, where was the IRR during apartheid? What was their stance on separation of tribes, allowing for self-determination?
We think back here. First things first, the IRR had always been in opposition of apartheid for two good reasons. You cannot build a free society by having any form of government, whatever ideological underpinning it has, that literally decides winners and losers in society based on race or anything other than equal rights for people. So the IRR has been consistent in that, because remember, it's a classically liberal organization. Insofar as the argument of self-determination, sorry, maybe repeat the latter bit of it, because there's a little bit of sleight of hand when people talk about this.
Right.
And I'll unpack it in like a minute. Just can you repeat her framing of the question?
Oh, I've just deleted it. But it was to do with the IRR and apartheid.
Yeah, but the second point of her question is actually what I think she was really asking, because remember, apartheid worked on the guise that it's best to separate people along their tribal lines, because arguably that is how best they can develop. It was basically a separate but equal argument, but really there was not much in the way of equality in it. But the separate element is often confused with self-determination, which is what I'm actually quite in favor of. But it's often confused as being what apartheid wanted to do. That's not what apartheid wanted to do at all. But let me be precise and specific. And why I say I actually support self-determination. I self-identify as a Zulu man. I don't call myself black. I'm black if you wanna use that expression, but that to me holds no identity that describes who I really am culturally, and who I am as an individual. I describe myself as Ngobese, who was raised by a single parent, who gave me certain values. I'm converting to Judaism, so that also speaks to my values. I'm a Zulu individual with certain experiences. The notion of black doesn't feature on that because it holds no sway in describing who I am. Equally, I don't like describing a white person as white because it says nothing about them. It doesn't say what their heritage are, how they were raised, etc., and the values that they actually hold. So that is the folly of a government that therefore uses race as a metric to argue that either there should be separate development or decides rather winners and losers on that basis. That is the folly of it, and why the IR will never stand for that, because it's morally repugnant, to be honest. However, is there an argument to be made that because of our differences culturally, that you could argue certain parts of the country have a certain way of governing because of their culture and their history? For instance, what happens in the Western Cape and the Cape in terms of its history is different to Zululand and KZN. That's not a function of race, but a function of the culture, the history, and all the experiences that go into defining who the people of that region are. Thus, I have no problem if South Africa became more of a federal state.
I think that's the way to go.
Absolutely. Where you don't have a central authority, you don't have a damn bureaucrat in Pretoria telling me all the way in, Underberg, KZN, what's best for me and my family. No, I would rather I elected my public representatives to be as local as possible and as representative as possible. So I'm much in favor of a municipality. I think that the strongest level of government should be at that level. And at the least, you could have some form of a provincial or state authority, that has limited powers, but really that's it. At a national level or a federal level, I just believe there should be a presidency, and basically that's it. Maybe the arts also to defend the state in its entirety, but that's really it. Again, the limiting of power is what I'd argue, and a federal state I'm in favor for, but that's not what apartheid was trying to do.
Yeah. Okay, now, next question. Gordon Blues has said, why has the SACP never stood for election?
Good question. Fantastic question. Remember I said to you that South Africans don't actually have an appetite for outwardly communist propaganda and nonsense. Why? Because the vast majority of South Africans are God-fearing, law-abiding, family-orientated, and really are non-racial in how they want society to be prosperous. No one sits here and goes, if that white person could be less rich, I'll be more rich. People recognize that's poppycock. It doesn't make sense, because I can use that same reasoning and go, that small elite that the ANC created of black elites, if they were less rich, I'll be more rich. So people are logical, guys. Trust you me. I know we don't see it because our mainstream media is invested in the social justice nonsense, the claptrap. We then don't see the real South Africa and how people think. So to your question, the SACP know, as all hardline lefties historically have known in this country, that they're a non-starter. At best, they represent electorally no more than 10 or 12% of the electorate. What do I mean by this? Last gasp. Even in 1994, the gaggle of parties that considered themselves hardline ultra-leftists. And remember them. They're the ones who say things like, we must create a socialist, communist South Africa. We must drive these whites into the sea. You remember that rhetoric if you're old enough. those parties, where are they today? Gone. And not only are they gone, it took nearly 26 years for them to find something else to sort of collect themselves under a banner of, i.e. the EFF. That's why it doesn't surprise me that the EFF has almost reached its cap at around 10, 11%, because that's always been the sort of fringe of the hard left in this country. So the SNCP know that. They know that they'll be swimming in a pond that has other piranhas in it. So what do? They ride on the coattails of the ANC, which has liberation nostalgia more than leftist ideology. And they seek to rather influence that at a party level in order to try and push through their rhetoric. But even then, they can't overtly do it. They must use race as a mask of it by arguing that the race is progressive. And then they hide the actual communist underpinnings behind the nonsense.
Right. So what we could actually say is that if the ANC was an egg, the SACP would be the yolk of the egg. But it's about time we fried that egg.
Spot on. I cannot even describe that in more lucid terms. Absolutely. I mean, we don't need it in this country. And as I said, as I demonstrated earlier on, and I won't be long, as I demonstrated earlier on, you're not alone, dear South African, whether you're white or black. There are literally millions of other South Africans who feel exactly the way you do, and they just say, you know what, instead of me trying to force a vote elsewhere, because I don't see anything that represents me, I'd rather just not vote. And they now form the majority of South Africans at an electoral level. The majority of the people just don't vote. And I argue, one day in our in our politics, if you will, that conservative party, if you will, not that I'm shilling for it or I want that, but I'm describing the world as it is, basically. I think that Conservative Party will rise up and you'll see something develop in this country, which basically sucks up those 12, 13 million and even a large portion of ANC people. Right. Something different.
Right. Now, Anita Zonda has asked, please, why is Malema so quiet?
Ah, yes. I made this point in vlog 25 on my channel, where I said, all along, the ruse, the fugazi, has now been burst. The EFF in Parliament like to position themselves as, yes, we are the opposition. We're going to make life as difficult as it possibly can for the ANC, points of orders, frivolous nonsense, right? Yeah. To get attention. But in real terms, on real substantive issues, they don't oppose the ANC. They're just another faction of the ANC, lending their 8, 9, 10% rather, to an ANC which is waning in support. How do we know this? Because when that real opposition was required now, when a real alternative politically was there's fertile ground for it right now under the lockdown and an unhappy society, where are the EFF? Nowhere to be seen. Yeah. If anything, they've become the purring cat on the lap of Cyril Ramaphosa, basically agreeing to everything that the state has sanctioned and put in place. So the bubble burst, the illusion burst. And I actually shared on my social media a screen grab of a lady who follows me, I think, who basically posted a picture of her EFF garb, like the beret and the red T-shirts and all that, and said, you know what, I've seen the light. This party is trash. Anybody who wants this can literally inbox me and I'll ship it to you for free. And a lot of people are literally seeing that because they recognize there is no intellectual diversity in our politics.
Which brings me to the next question.
Yes.
The next question is, if the ANC fractures, will one of those fractured ANC groups join the EFF, or will the EFF join them?
Sorry, I'm just away from my mic for a second. Just give me 10
okay.
seconds. I'm just reaching down for the last battery.
Yeah. Okay, guys, I'm just addressing the side chat. Look, we're getting into your questions now. Thanks for your patience. It's been a fascinating evening, and I'm hoping we can get Sihle back again in the future, because there's so much stuff we could talk about. It's quite extraordinary. Are you back, Sihle?
I should be back on your screens.
There you are. I see you. Fantastic. We're getting through your batteries, are we?
Oh, I've just locked this one too.
Okay.
Oh no. Okay, so that's it. That's the end of my batteries. But I think you can hear me.
We can hear you. Yeah.
The question?
Okay. If the ANC fractures, will one of those fractures join the EFF, or will the EFF join one of those fractures?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I think at this point it doesn't matter, to be honest. I know this is what we sort of play out. The mainstream sort of analysis sort of focuses on this, but it misses. I mean, that's basically looking at the hole in the barn door and not the actual barn door itself. And the barn door itself is, again, if I circle back, that vast majority of electorally eligible people who don't vote, they're the ones who are going to shape future elections in this country. It isn't the what's that game we used to play in kindergarten, musical chairs. It isn't the musical chairs of a bit of loss in the EFF here, a bit of gain in the ANC there. No, that's all irrelevant now. You've now reached a point where more people literally say we want something different, and we haven't had someone galvanize them under a banner that echoes our values, right? Of these God-fearing, law-abiding, family-orientated, and really non-racial South Africans. We're just sick of being pitted against each other. Like, that's what you need to understand about South Africans. We're sick and tired of being pitted against each other because it seems counterproductive to a population of people who kind of go, hang on, in my daily lived experience, I don't recognize what I'm being told is the lived experience of whites hating me or whites hoarding all the wealth or all of that nonsense. I recognize a South African where I wake up, I greet my neighbor. He happens to be Afrikaans. We sometimes braai when the Springboks are playing. Our kids go to the same school, etc., etc. That's the lived reality. And part of it is breaking, of course, the apartheid structural spatial planning to achieve even more of it, right? So you need to break things like the idea of townships and actually have people live amongst each other, because that's the best way people can see that what they're being fed by politicians as a narrative is absolute trash. That this person is not my enemy. They're a fellow South African. They care about family just like I do. They go to church just like I do. They derive values from that church that are similar to mine. So why exactly is this person quote unquote my enemy? I think that's what the ANC is really afraid of at an everyday level, and at a broader political level, they're damn afraid of this growing number of urbanizing South Africans who are joining the league or the legion, if you will, of that 12, 13 million that I spoke about, who are eligible to vote but are literally waiting to pull the trigger.
Right. Now, Tace Lawrence has asked, or I think it might be Do the Five has asked, ask Big Daddy, why is there still so much hate against a white man? And I think that's something that you just touched on there.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't want to diminish this. There is a hateful narrative in our country. But again, guys, don't be distracted. Ask yourself, where does that narrative really come from? Is it coming from ordinary South Africans? People who you wake up every day, you greet on the side of the street and whatever? Or is it being driven by individuals, or really groups, if you will, that have a vested interest in suggesting that there are differences amongst us based on race? I think once people are honest, it does take a bit of introspection, and it does take a bit of removing yourself from yourself at times in terms of your biases, and actually looking at the kind of society that we really are. You then begin to see that the whole idea that we are a hateful society that hates each other based on race is an absolute ruse. And it's a ruse, unfortunately, which is capitalized by certain politicians who are dependent on us viewing each other with suspicion. That's why they hate
divide and rule.
Absolutely. And they hate when we have moments of national pride, let's say in sports. Okay, let me give a practical example. Have you ever noticed how whenever South Africa does well in sports and the whole country is behind a particular team or a particular sports person, that politicians at the end always want to hijack that sentiment? They always want to be like, yeah, hey, look at me, I'm the politician who made this happen. Remember, so if you like this feeling, keep supporting me. And then when you are lulled into that false premise, you then listen to what that politician says on any given Sunday, and they're full of hate. And then you kind of you ask yourself, heck, how did we go from being, a society that just recognizes the value of unity Again, I'm not saying we have to be kumbaya and everything's perfect. That's not the argument. But there is a sense of unity given the everyday experience of South Africans. And the everyday experience of us is that at an interpersonal level, there is voluntary cooperation in this country. When the, and I'm going to be a bit trite here, but when you're pulling into some parking lot and that guy comes and tries to help you park in the space, and that poor black chap tries, sort of guides you, like, yes, come, reverse. Like, at no point do you think to yourself, and I'm putting myself in the position of a white person, and I hate that expression, but I'm just for the sake of my example, no white person sits in their car as that guy's guiding them backwards and thinking, oh, how dare this black person help me? Like, doesn't he know that all white people hate blacks? And equally, that car guard doesn't stand there going, doesn't this white person know that we blacks hate white? Like, no one thinks like that.
Yeah.
Like, if you actually take a moment to talk to your fellow South African, you'll realize that no one actually damn well thinks like that. But instead, our politics has to drive that narrative, has to drive that false reality that says, we're at a cusp of a race war, and that the evil whites hate you, and they're hoarding all the wealth under white monopoly capital, and the blacks, oh my goodness, the blacks, man, they're going to eat you up. They're going to cook you in a big pot and have a bone in their nose. All of that nonsense is racist stereotyping, but the politicians thrive on that. I nearly saw. Yeah. The politicians thrive on that nonsense. And I'm saying to you, dear South African, especially the person who asked the question, take a moment, for instance, to watch my channel when I hit the streets of the country all over, in cities across the country, and I talk to people on basic issues. I think the scales will be removed from a lot of people's eyes when they realize just how alike we are and how the politics doesn't match the reality of who we are as South Africans.
Okay. Now, Leona Huxham has asked, what are your views on the Bill Gates conspiracy theories and the involvement of the ANC?
Yeah, I have been watching this. Look, I don't really have a formed opinion. I struggle to dabble in the world of conspiracy because, as I said, even as I began, I genuinely like to work off of the basis of facts and opinion, even if that points to verifying a conspiracy. That's fine, but I often need actual hard evidence, facts, in order to form a considered opinion. I don't venture in the world of maybe this conspiracy is that and this. I can't. It's not within my brand, unfortunately.
Okay.
Sorry, I hope that doesn't sound dismissive. I can't. Like I've. No,
that's fine. We've got about 20 questions to go, just to let you know.
Sure.
Christian Mulder has asked, what does Big Daddy think about the EFF and in particular Julius Malema's goals?
Politicians are trash. Absolute trash. Whether they are hardline leftist ideologues or nefarious individuals of whatever stripe, I hold no quarter for politicians. And let me explain why. If no politician can stand on a podium, look South Africans in the face and say, I'm here to dismantle the state by and large, and literally keep it to what is the actual role of the state, right? And to the best of my ability to dismantle the power of the state and to put it into your hands, dear citizens. Unless a politician says that, then I hold no quarter for the politician.
Right.
Now, as to Julius Malema himself, he perhaps represents the worst of who I say I have a sharp disliking for. Here's a guy who's never in a single day of his life earned a rand in an honest way. He's always leached off of someone else, either as a politician, living off of the state trough, or as a crooked cader who's alleged to have fleeced money from not only the VBS Bank, but even in his days in the ANC Youth League. Here's a guy who was alleged to have been, at the center, to a large extent, of the bankrupting of the state of the province of Limpopo. Like, this guy's never really been a contributing member of society. He's lived off of us, for goodness sake. And then people, especially the sort of trendy lefty blacks that often attack me on my social media, they genuinely expect me to support this guy. And I'm like, Sihle, I nearly swore. But are you guys like literally? Are you off your rocker? Like, on what basis do you ask me, the child of a single parent who is physically handicapped? That parent, by the way, who yes initially was dependent on social grants, but literally worked her ass off to become a businesswoman so that she could provide a better life for her son. Me, you're asking that person who has those values to now trust a politician who says we need to be state dependent and we need to hate white South Africans? I'm sorry, it just doesn't work that way.
Right. Now, Marissa's asked, what are your thoughts on Maceo, Lakota and the COPE party?
Yeah. Interesting question. Shame, I'm actually I feel sorry for Maceo to a large extent. I think he means well, but I don't know. COPE for me is not the vehicle that people thought it was. I think, and this is why it goes back to your question, Scott, about, if there's a fracturing of the ANC. Do you think, your question is about the EFF in that context, but yeah. I took a step further in my analysis, and I said any fracture from the ANC should be viewed in the most dubious of terms, because you've got to remember these are people who are also, yes, they may be breaking away from the ANC, but you need to ask yourself the question, why? Remember, they're steeped in the rhetoric of the National Democratic Revolution. They're steeped in the ideology of being a society, having a society that picks people based on race to be winners and losers. So when they break away, are they breaking away because they now reject that ideology, or they just don't like how it's being enforced, or rather they're not within the inner circle of those enforcing and enjoying the trappings of power? So I'm always skeptical, unfortunately, or fortunately rather, of any breakaway from the ANC, which unfortunately Maceo Lakota is a part of that.
Right. Keenan Fundamis says, please, the question, opinion on the Chinese police training.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Just to cancel that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Did you hear the question?
Chinese training?
Yeah.
No, sir, I didn't.
Okay. Keenan Fundamis has asked the question or opinion on the Chinese police training in South Africa.
Yeah, that's a bit of a weird one. Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Hi, sorry, I thought I lost a moment.
I'm here.
Okay. Yeah, look, I'm very worried about the influence of the Chinese period in South Africa. I think there's something dangerous developing here, and I think for the ANC, it's being underpinned by their ideology, which ironically, if you talk to the Chinese themselves, I often say the Chinese are communist in name only. I mean, here's a society which, the only thing they've retained from quote unquote communism is the authoritarian aspect of it. But in terms of everything else in that society, it is a society wholly dependent on markets and capitalism, and essentially raising the living standards of their citizens. So they've done everything right in that regard, but have unfortunately kept the authoritarian nature of their communist history. So when I then look at the relationship, the very cozy relationship, by the way, of the ANC to the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, I think for the ANC, it's their drunken stupor of still thinking that communism works, and for the Chinese Communist Party, it's the opportunity of literally almost a free for all for the one economy in Africa that has good infrastructure, deep financial markets, etc., etc. So they look at us and they think, "Oh, goody, goody, we can exploit this country, and then use it as a base to expand into the rest of the continent." And I don't think the ANC at a political level see that, because they sort of are still believing that, these are fellow commies and they're going to look after us and they're going to love us. Chinese, unfortunately, don't operate on that principle.
Yeah.
Chinese come to a certain part of the world, they are extractive. They're almost a new colonial power to an extent. And, even the Australians are learning this the hard way. Those Chinese looked at those mines in deep parts of Australia, and they just thought, oh, goody gumdrops, these guys are going to fund the expansion of the Chinese manufacturing empire. And I think the Australian government's only now beginning to sort of wake up to that nonsense and push back it. And you're having and you're not having the same thing, is what I mean to say, in South Africa. In South Africa, we're actually welcoming this in, and we're looking at it as a foreign investment. It's not. It's exploitative in nature.
It's a takeover.
Yeah, it really is. And I'm really worried because on the one level, as a last sentence, on the one level, I welcome, of course, a world which trades more, and there's the raising of living standards across the world. You want that. We genuinely want that. But you also want a federal government or a national government which actually protects the nation state and its particular interests. And I don't think you have that when you have a gaggle of politicians, commie politicians in our country, who are so enamored by the Chinese that they don't see the reality of what's happening.
Right. Now, Tace Lawrence says, from what I've heard and understand, that Chinese police training is fake news. Now, CJHS says, how does the BDL... Hi, Sihle, are you there?
Hi, sorry, I think you lost me there for a moment.
Okay, I can see you now again.
Okay, wonderful. That works.
So I don't know what happened there, but I can see you, which is great. Okay.
Let me just get the lighting right, but otherwise I'm back.
Okay, so CJHS has asked, how does the BDL think we're going to get the non-voter to vote?
Yeah, CJ, that is the question of our time, isn't it? But I'll offer this man, and I'm venturing into the realm a little bit of guessing here, but I'll try to tie in as much data as I can. As I mentioned before, right, when I was talking about the character of those 12, 13 million who are eligible to vote but don't vote, and who, if they, for whatever reason, decided to enter the election and vote, would literally blow the entry out the water. I think it will require the rising up and the developing of a profile of perhaps a sexy, young, look, because of the society we are, they may have to. All right, I want to think about this. Okay, so here's how I'll answer this question. I think if you had aesthetically a Justin Trudeau type, in terms of what they look like, right? Young, sexy, looks intelligent insofar as, varsity educated, blah, 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 you name it. Not his politics, just his looks. And a Donald Trump personality where doesn't take crap, literally mocks his opponents for their silliness. Not that he himself is silly, but mocks his opponents for their silliness.
He's so funny.
And does what someone like Pierre Botha did. Wow, and I know when I mention this, people will lose their minds. Not that I support him, I'm just a characteristic he had politically was his ability to play off his opponents against each other so that he dominates the space, right? So that's the only characteristic I'm saying this mashup politician I'm talking about needs to have. And then lastly, he must have a Thabo Mbeki-esque disdain for the left and the ideas of the left, and literally be a hardcore zealot, almost like Herman Mashaba, if I can bring him in as an example, a hardcore zealot for the idea of building a prosperous society based on market fundamentals. If the market is providing for South Africans, it shouldn't matter what the race of those South Africans is. Not that Mbeki was like that per se. I mean, he was a bit of a race merchant himself. But I can't fault him for his ability to have turned South Africa, which was heavily indebted, into a country suddenly of surplus and a growing economy year on year of 5% plus. Those are the best years of the ANC. That's from about 2003 to 2007, where literally you had a president, one Thabo Mbeki, who had a disdain the Communist Party, who had a disdain for the lefties in the ANC, and basically recognized that the only way you can create wealth in South Africa is by literally building a market economy that creates surplus and that absorbs people into the economy. Now, as I'm saying this, let me throw some numbers in so you don't think I'm BSing you. The best period of growth in South Africa under the ANC, as I said, happened under those years, where we literally added 10 million poor South Africans onto the payroll as being employed people. 10 million people were added to that payroll. Under that period, for every shack that was built in South Africa, 10 formal homes were built in South Africa. If you look at the data, there was a rising of incomes, of course. Like, I can go down the line in terms of describing the data. In fact, as maybe a final point, South Africa was getting quite prosperous to the extent that even the rollout of social welfare, the social grants and the like, was funded through the surplus that was created in the state books. It wasn't debt. It wasn't borrowing. We were literally funding, whether you believe in that welfare or not, is not what I'm prosecuting here as a point. I'm just saying, in terms of where the money came from, the market was beginning to provide the surpluses and the excesses of it were beginning to provide even for the commies who wanted to have a welfare state. So you had something that looked almost like the Scandinavian countries, where they have market economies that generate a lot of wealth, and then the government taxes that wealth in order to fund their welfare pipe dream. South Africa was almost becoming something like that under the Mbeki years. But of course, 2007 came, or rather 2009 came, and did not one Jacob Zuma dismantle all of that?
Right. Now, you talked about the right leader. Herman Mashaba, the Johannesburg mayor, he's gone out on his own. And I've read some of his articles, and he seems to have a very good position on things. What are your views about Herman Mashaba?
Yeah, Herman's a bit of a mixed bag for me. The early Herman that I loved, and who inspired a lot of young black chaps like me, who are liberty-minded and free market tears. That Herman we fell in love with, the businessman, the entrepreneur, because he was, openly saying what South Africa needs, and in particular black community needs, is more capitalism, is more markets, and really the access to it, which is hinged on things like a good education, good healthcare, blah, blah, blah. I think that Herman gave way at some point when he joined the Democratic Alliance into becoming this almost weird Herman. That's why I said he's mixed bag for me. Who suddenly takes issue with things that aren't South Africa's problems necessarily, and plays to a bit of a populist crowd. And I'm not a big fan of that side of Herman, because suddenly he started playing the race card, for example, arguing, the DA is a white party, and they're taking exception to me because I was pushing a black agenda. That crap he was picking up from his close relationship with the EFF, because of how the coalition structure was because of the coalition arrangement, in the city of Johannesburg that thrusted him to be mayor. He was beholden to the EFF, and you could see that begin to influence him in how he thinks and his rhetoric and the like. So that for me diminished him quite a bit as leadership material, because if you're not someone who can hold the line in terms of your principles, and you can throw those principles away as quickly and as willy-nilly as he did in order to bend the knee to the EFF to keep the support, that sort of threw people like me off, because there is no synergy with a free marketeering type thinker and a red in tooth and claw communist party like the EFF. Like, I just don't see that synergy, and he tried to make it work, and he lost my support.
Right. Now, Michelle Mullard has asked, what is our option to change things around? I guess that could also be to turn things around.
Sure. Look, let me speak in terms of our current affairs. Number one, we've got to end the lockdown right now. We cannot continue crippling what was left of productive parts of South Africa. It's untenable, and really behind it is a ideological crusade by the ANC, which, as I mentioned, was socialist and communist in nature. What they're trying to do is weaken what they term white monopoly capital, so that they can turn around at the end of it and say, you see, that white capital that you guys had thought was giving you the jobs and the blah, 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 is now, it's dead, right? So you need to look to us, the politicians, to provide for you. I reject that. And I'm saying, in part of rejecting that, the following needs to happen. Number one, end the lockdown. Number two, because I know they won't end it, I would say, just based on the world we live in, that there needs to be a sunset clause or a suspension of things like affirmative action and BEE and all these counterproductive pieces of legislation that add to the cost of doing business in this country. They're not beneficial to the country, let alone to the people that it claims to be beneficial for, i.e. Black South Africans. End that crap very quickly. Wipe out a lot of the red tape that comes with these communist politicians who are placed in cabinets, guys like Ibrahim Patel, Rob Davies was in previous administration. End that crap and literally free the economy, free the entrepreneur, whether they're black or white is irrelevant, free the damn entrepreneur in this country to be the wealth creating individual who sucks in the unemployed and, to a large extent, the unemployable in this country, and rebuild South African industry and sectors so that we actually create the jobs that are desperately needed, that then raise living standards and bring people back into the middle class. That's critically important. So cutting the red tape, and last but not least, oh my goodness, break the state. Break the influence on the state on a lot of things. And you can begin with the enabling opportunities, as I described earlier, on things like healthcare, education, and safety and security. Right. As much as possible, remove the state from that or limit the state and have it literally pass resources onto the poor. So that the poor are the ones who make decisions about what's best for them and their families, and they can raise that living standard that I speak of. If you can do that, then you have a real shot at bringing and pulling South Africa away from the edge. And to be honest, one foot has already fallen off the edge. We're literally just hanging on by a thread now.
Well, Ramaphosa is already talking about imposing more black economic transformation on South Africa after the lockdown. I mean, that's going to destroy what's left. Now, Neville Roscoe has asked, what about domestics and gardeners? No work. I'm supporting both my maid and gardener, and will do so while I can. So, what do you feel about that?
Absolutely, guys. I don't think we understand. Not that I don't think we understand. I think we've somewhat conditioned ourselves to not see poor people, to sort of almost like throw them out of our immediate periphery. And it's only when you experience their plight in terms of the interpersonal relationship we have with them. So in most cases, a lot of us know, or have rather, a domestic help or someone who does the garden, right? That individual is not the creme de la creme of our society. That individual literally lives hand to mouth. The people who you see as informal traders on the side of the road live hand to mouth. Their daily income is what determines whether they have a meal at the end of the table. It's that individual who I've argued to you has been completely left out of the planning by the ANC of this particular lockdown. Again, it's testament to the argument I made earlier on, that when they devised this lockdown, they're so aloof that they didn't even think about poor people. Like, it was an afterthought when poor people started saying, hey, hang on, like, we're starving here and we can't do what you're telling us to do, which is social distance and all the like.
Well, it's like
when that.
It's like. Carry on.
And when those same poor people then have to do what they always have to do in this country, which is, when you don't pay attention to us, we need to take to the streets, burn stuff to bring attention. Like, I'm not condoning that, but think about their plight. Like, that's the only way they can get the attention of the same crooked coalition of politicians who govern them. And it's those poor people now that I'm putting it to you, who are looking at the current electoral results, or rather the political outcomes of what they have, and they're going, nope, we're not going to repeat this.
Yeah.
We're not going to repeat this.
Well, it reminds me rather of Marie Antoinette, who famously said, You know, if they can't have bread, let them eat cake. You know, that's how out of touch the black privileged ANC cadres are. Now,
Absolutely.
let's go on to the next question here. Audrey says, I was in a bomb blast on the 30th November 1993 on a bus in Durban City. Was it kept low profile not to disturb the transition? Would this be a tactic? There was only one day when it was in the news.
Wow, Durban, that's a Durbanite there speaking. And shout out to you, Marie. Sorry, I missed the name, but shout out to you as a fellow Durbanite. Yeah, we've been through a lot, haven't we? And I do believe that incidents like those speak to what I described earlier on as being planned and part of what was called the People's War. And, I spoke of it in sort of just a gloss over to a large extent. But what I didn't mention is there are people to this day who still have the scars of the ANC's campaign of destabilizing its black opponents back then. And of course, goading the then nationalist government into concessions which, under perhaps more an honest climate of negotiation wouldn't have been concessions that they would have made. What I didn't mention in all of that is that thousands upon thousands upon thousands of South Africans lost their lives, were maimed, all for nothing really. If and again, hear me out when I say that. I don't mean that your pain and your suffering was for nothing. But what I'm saying is, the nefariousness of those who were doing it did it, and it was unnecessary, is the point I'm making. So maybe I should use that expression as opposed to saying for nothing. It was totally unnecessary, and it comes back to the evil that we have normalized by normalizing the ANC. Nothing about these guys is normal. They are an evil lot. A lot of them will never account for their crimes back in that day. And again, blame goes all around. I'm not saying the Nats were like these perfect angels. Of course not. The Nats, if anything, were just as vicious in the exploitation of not only black South Africans, but also white South Africans to a large extent. I mean, imagine living in those days of having to live in fear because your government's policies have created an enemy out of people who should not be an enemy. Imagine having your kids, teenagers, being conscripted into an army that's going to fight a war which, people lost their lives, others were maimed, and the scars of some of those wars are still with, a lot of middle-aged white South Africans, and especially the men. I have guys, as I said, I tour this country and I'm talking to people from all walks. Like, I don't pick and choose who I talk to. I had a group in KZN, I won't mention where. And some of these guys came to me and said, you're the first black South African, if anything, who I've spoken to who's able to relate to everybody and understand what everybody went through, not only back then, but even today. You don't judge us. You don't bring any preconceived judgment or hate or suspicion. And I mean, these guys openly said they knew what they were doing was wrong, but they were young men. And they were young men in a system which literally cajoled them into a way of life which no South African should ever go through ever again, is what I'm arguing. Yeah. Whether it's based on race or whatever the case may be. So to your question, ma'am, I feel like there were incidents that happened back then which were just brushed aside for convenience. And people paid with their lives in some cases. Others were maimed, and on all sides, by the way. And I don't want to sound like I'm advocating for one over the other. I think we lived in a time where the violence created in that South Africa just didn't have to happen, and the scars of it still endure to this day.
Right. Now I've got a message here or a question here from Corvid, or I call him D in emails. He says, is BDL growing disciples to help spread his enthusiasm and passion to fix South Africa?
Yeah, well, yes, that is a brilliant question. And again, watch my show to see what I'm talking about. I think what I've done quite well, if I can blow my own trumpet here for a bit, is also bring out other South Africans, black South Africans too, who before would have never spoken out because of the fear of being a black South African who doesn't think like the commies and the ANC and the political elites want us to think. And there was a real fear and a real ostracization that happens when you're that sort of individual, a free-thinking black South African. Maybe you're a bit of a conservative, maybe you're a classical liberal, but or you're on the right, generally speaking. There was a real fear, and it almost represented the fear that even if you go back in our history, there used to be these whites who were called Kafabotis because they were like, no, the system of governance we have and how it's treating black people is absolutely trash. But look at how those people were treated also back then, with deep suspicion, with invective thrown at them. How dare you question the big state? And I put it to you that you have the same thing happening today, where there are a lot of black South Africans, like conservative, God-fearing, family-orientated South African, who say this is wrong. All of this nonsense, the racial society, the pining for socialism, all of this is wrong. It doesn't represent me as a South African, as a black South African. It doesn't represent me as a Zulu. It doesn't represent me as a Xhosa, a Venda, whatever. And they get absolutely, victimized and ganged up upon by these, social justice warrior types. And by the way, those social justice warrior types, the lefties, I like to call them trendy lefties, you'll find them both in black middle-class South Africa and white middle-class South Africa. Yeah. And on my channel, if you watch my show, I often derisively, as I make fun of their race obsession, I call the black ones the Blabbity Blacks. Blabbity being an American magazine for black millennials. So they view all issues through quote-unquote blackness and leftist ideology. And, the social justice whites, as I like to call them all, the social justice he speaks so well type whites, the ones who are so enamored by someone like Cyril Ramaphosa that they don't see the reality of his nonsense. Yeah. And they say things like, but Cyril's our savior. He's part of the good ANC, they'll say. Those two groups, the Blabbity Blacks and the SJW whites, who are both in the middle class, by the way, are a vast schism. There's a vast schism between them and ordinary South Africans of all races who just say, hang on, we see the reality and we're not buying into the nonsense.
Right. Now, we're nearly 2.5 hours into this live stream, and we still got a whole bunch of questions to ask. So look, I don't want to. I need to know what's your cutoff time. I mean, I'm happy to go. We've still got about 20 questions here.
Can we go till 11, and we can call it an evening at 11?
So
11 my time.
Yeah, that's 40 minutes from now. So. Let's keep
enough time?
Yeah, let's keep the answers very, very short.
Yes.
Christian says, Big Daddy's opinion on the possibility of a civil war.
Oh, wow, no. South Africans don't have an appetite for war. We really don't. I think we demonstrated that in the transition period where we were just sick and tired of the violence, both black and white South Africans. And this is why, by the way, I was saying the People's War strategy by the ANC was so effective, because they had to stoke the violence and the killings and essentially the warlike culture or climate rather in KZN, because they innately they know that South Africans are by and large we don't have the stomach for that stuff. So I don't think South Africa's issues will be resolved through conflict. I don't think we have the appetite for that. With that being said, and I must say this, those South Africans who are smart are South Africans who know that they need to protect themselves and their families. So it won't be a war in a sense, like organized militias. But I do believe if shit were to hit the fan, first time I swore, sorry about that.
That's okay.
But if crap were to hit the fan, having an armed citizenry, which I'm very much in favor of, would be a critical component to not war per se, but protecting communities, protecting families. I myself am a big advocate for gun ownership, responsible gun ownership. And if you watch any of my videos, I have lots, trust me, where I'm shooting all sorts of manner of rifles, and I'm talking to experts, guys at Gun Owners South Africa, for example, Prosperous, a friend of mine, Sihle Ngobese. Just search for Prosperous on Twitter, you'll see what I'm talking about. So yeah, I'm a big advocate of that side of South Africa, but I don't foresee a war. I don't think we have the appetite for that.
Right. Okay, just for the record, Big Daddy's YouTube channel is linked below this video, so you can just click on that link to go to it. Now, Winston Barkhuizen has asked, why don't you start your own party? Believe me, a lot of South Africans will vote for your party.
Yeah, I get a lot of that. Look, guys, I'd make a terrible politician because I can't lie to people. Like, I struggle to do it. And I say this as someone who, I used to be in formal party politics. I cut my teeth as a young man after my studies at UCT in the Democratic Alliance. You know, I used to be in their research office initially. And then as I grew in seniority, in the party, I began to run some of the communications machinery in the Northern Cape and other parts of the country where I worked for that party, including at the last iteration working for the Western Cape government under Helen Zille, when she was still Premier. So I understand the beast that is party politics and formal politics. I just don't think that's where I need to be, because there's and this is what made me unpopular in the party. I'm the guy who holds the line on ideology. I don't sway, I don't buckle, I don't shift from principles, and I become very vicious to the point where a lot of the politicians in the DA and other parties, by the way, know me very well. When I suspect that you are not what you say, are you deceitful? There's something that really makes my blood boil when I see a deceitful politician of whatever party, by the way, because any of you who follow me online, you know that I'm vicious with the politicians. Like I hold no quarter, to the point where a lot of them block me because I'm just unrelenting. Because a lot of it is I respect South African families and individuals much more than I will any political party or anything like that. I love South Africans. Like, it's weird. I get really emotional when I talk about this because I don't think people understand how much I love South Africans. I love people. Like, I will live and die for families in this country of what, like, your race doesn't matter. Like, if you are a God-fearing, law-abiding, family-oriented South African who yearns for freedom, who yearns for a market economy, I will literally lay my life down for you, because there is something far greater that I'm fighting for here that I feel like being in formal politics won't allow for. That's why I'm grateful to the Institute of Race Relations, because to an extent they helped me walk away from all of that, right?
Yeah.
Because I was a guy who was becoming quite unpopular in the DA because I was asking hard questions. Are you guys still classically liberal? Because there's a lot of socialist rhetoric in this party now. Yeah. There's a lot of authoritarian rhetoric in this party now, is what I used to say. And what I always do as a last class, because I want to keep the answer short, is I would rather, with the next 5-10 years of my life, do what I'm doing now and grow my numbers outside of party politics. As I said, there's two things that I do. There's the air war, which is the YouTubing and the videos and the radio and blah, blah, blah. Then there's the ground war, where I'm building structures across this country. I often meet stockfiles around the country, black stockfiles. I get invited to do a talk. I often go to informal traders associations, informal settlements organizations, often invite me to talk. So when I ask people, for example, to fund the work that I do on Patreon or whatever, it's to fund that. Because that's my bread and butter in terms of my core functions. I'm talking to people, I'm building an army, if you will, of liberty-minded people. And I don't tell people who to vote for, that's not my job. But I literally say, these are the values you should fight for, and these are the ideas that you can stand behind. And then it's up to you, dear South African, whether you live in an informal settlement, a township or suburbia, to rally and build something politically that you can support.
I'm surprised you don't have a target on your back from the ANC. I mean.
Well, let's just say I'm very prepared. If you've seen my episodes on my rifle wielding moments, I'm very prepared for any attempts at me. Like I'm like, hey man, if I was in America, I'd probably be like some bitch from like the mountains. Like I'm that guy. Like I'm very, very, very pro gun. So. Yeah, word of warning to anybody, any commie watching this and thinking, oh, I'm going to attack this guy. But yeah, look, I'm not stupid. I do recognize the kind of country I live in, and I do take precautions.
Yeah. Now, Sai has asked, Is the rumor that Cyril Ramaphosa is stepping down true, in your opinion?
I don't know if that's true. Again, I hate delving in the world of opinion and conspiracy, but I haven't seen the data for it. What I've seen instead, what I can verify, is, remember I mentioned to you that this lockdown has exposed the two camps in government. They are the securocrats and the commies, and what I can broadly call the Ramaphosites, because they're not really reformers. Initially we used to call them reformers, and they're not. I think they're just like the Ramaphosites, the anybody but Zuma types, who rode the wave of Cyril Ramaphosa's initial popularity in order to stay in power. Those are the two camps that I think are beginning to flex their muscles using this lockdown period. And what I think is happening is Cyril politically recognizes that he's the minority of those two camps. That's why I don't think we've seen him address the nation in over 3 weeks, because the last time he did, he made an announcement as a supposed commander-in-chief, and then just a week later, his ministers literally, reneged on what he had promised. Small example, meaning he said, lockdown, we're going to allow the sale of cigarettes, for example. And then almost a week later, actually not a week, a few days later, his would-be opponent at the last, what was his opponent, at the last elected conference, who leads her little cabal, literally said, no, we're not going to do that. How dare the president even try and suggest that he has the power? I make the decisions in this lockdown, and I've determined that we're not going to sell cigarettes, and we're going to keep it restrictive, and all the threats of the hell and fire and brimstone that is stoking the resentment towards the government at the moment. So, will he stand down or be pushed out? I don't think that's within the ambit of what will happen, because that'll be disastrous for them. Because Cyril, if you think about it, last cast, Cyril is the guy who they needed as the front man in order to help or make a lot of South Africans forget the Zuma years and convince you through the lie that this is a different ANC. This is a Cyril ANC. It's a reform ANC. So if they got rid of that guy, then they can kiss the electoral fortunes of whatever's left of them goodbye.
Yeah, well, I think it's horribly concerning that Dlamini Zuma is head of the NCCC. Now, let's get on to the next question. Gordon Blues asks, which non-racial meritocratic society would BDL like to emulate, if such a thing exists?
I think the last bit of your question is spot on. There aren't many in the way of a perfect ideal, right? But I could mix and match a few societies and argue we need to be something close to it. The Japanese are a good example, where there's a strong focus on empowering individuals at their formative years, right throughout their adolescent years, and of course into being young adults, with a good education, safety and security, all the things that I've mentioned already on the show. I think that'll be one fantastic model that you can look to. You can look to some of the Scandinavian countries even, insofar as their realization that building a market economy that then funds the welfare society, if that's what you want. I don't really want that, but I'm just making the point, is the ideal. That'll be, and even then, what they do really well is provide those enabling opportunities. America is a good example for me. Even then, that's like another topic in itself, but let me indulge it nonetheless. America is a good example of having a constitution which originally was meant to limit the power of the state, and place as much power and resources into the hands of individuals. That's why they have things like constitutionally enshrined freedoms, like the First Amendment, which is the right to free speech, and the Second Amendment, which is just in case that First Amendment doesn't work out. You need to have them guns, man, to protect not only yourself from the tyranny of men in government, but also your family and your community. So it's those sort of things which, if I were to mash them up into an ideal, it would look something close to that. But also I need to recognize the kind of country that I live in, right? And the realities we have, and that towards reaching my ideal would be a process and not just an overnight thing. I'm cognizant enough as a classical liberal / libertarian to know that my ideas are not going to be an overnight thing. But that's why the battle of ideas is important. It's he who injects the volume of ideas into a society at the point of crisis who will win. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, to build the number of people who think like me, and also to have them be advocates for these ideas in their communities so that you build that groundswell. So again, if you want to support that, please do, because that is actually my core function. That's what I do.
Right. Okay, now Grace Ngwichana has asked, after Marikana bloodshed, Ramaphosa rose to power. What will you say if he still rises to even higher power after the COVID-19 deaths?
I think that's unlikely. And we're already seeing it, right? Insofar as how the ANC is almost just keeping him as the mask to hide the ugly, if you will. And notice how, for example, after Marikana, even the EFF, which used to call him, the killer of miners and, the one who instigated Marikana, they stopped doing that. And I think they've stopped doing that because there's a faction in the ANC which probably asked them to stop doing that, because it affects. Remember, my central thesis was that the EFF are but an extension of the ANC. They are an extension of that radical economic transformation, communist ANC. And what the EFF has done really well is basically from outside of the ANC, in inverted commas, outside of the ANC, gather just enough support that will keep the side of the ANC that they want influential, right? So I know that doesn't make sense for some people listening, but as I said, there's two camps in the ANC, right? There are those commie types and the wannabe reformists, but not really reformists. The EFF are literally in bed, or they support the others, the commie side of the ANC. And that's why they've openly said historically that, we don't really hate the ANC. If they want our then 6% in order to enact things like expropriation, like compensation, the nationalization of the mines and all that nonsense, that they'll give them that electoral support to do that. So you've got to understand that the EFF are an extension of that ANC, and Ramaphosa therefore is beholden to that. He recognizes that power base, if you will, and not only does he recognize it, the other side has used him as the mask to hide that commie side. So they also need him. It's like a weird symbiotic relationship to an extent, where they need Ramaphosa just to be the mask to keep people fooled, but at the same time to keep working away at developing the commie side of the ANC.
Well, it must be quite clear then that Ramaphosa knows exactly what's going on within the ANC, so he is in effect deceiving everybody when he gets up there and talks. He's a con man. Now,
I think he's also quite selfish, because here's a guy who, again, this myth that he's a businessman needs to be burst. There's nothing businessman like about the guy. He is literally that literally made billionaires out of a small elite of individuals purely based on their skin color and their proximity to political power. There's nothing business-like about him. Anyway, I call him selfish because he disappeared from politics in order to make billions, but maybe there's something in him that said, hey, in those years of the Rolf Mayer and Cyril show, I could have been a big shot. I could have been something. Let me see if I can still be something. I think that's the only reason he came back into politics, was just to see, let's see if I can make it. Yeah. And it was convenient enough for the ANC after the Zuma years to literally capitalize on that and use him as a front man to lull people into the deception that the ANC had changed, and it hasn't changed one damn bit.
Yeah. Now, Mike Latoris has asked, when Malema warns the USA about not to interfere in internal politics, does he mean that, or is he rather pleased to have the Chinese take over South Africa?
Weird question. Bit of a weird question, that. I don't know how to answer that, because, again, it's such a nebulous issue to try and unpack in this question session.
Yeah.
That I won't go into too much detail, except to say that it goes back to the point I made about the lack of diversity in South African politics in real terms. And it's when you look at how they are so affable towards the Chinese, for you to realize just how much of a lack of diversity there really is. All of them are one iteration of leftist versus the other. So you have the center left, the statists, the one who believe that yes, the state shouldn't control everything, but it should be a powerful entity in deciding winners and losers in society. The center left status. And then you move further to the left, you have the outward leftist, the socialist, who says, no. In the pathway of getting to the communist ideal, we need the state to control, the levels of power, the levels of this and that. Then those guys look to other socialist societies as their case example. They ignore all the bad, of course. So, for example, they'll say things like, oh, look at Venezuela. Venezuela's fantastic because they've kicked out the imperialists and they now control all their resources, like the oil and all of that stuff. But then when you push them on the reality of what's happening on the ground, that's not a conversation they want to have. Last year, the ANC sent a delegation led by, I can't think of his name, Ace Mahashule, to Venezuela, and they came back with a glowing report. Oh, it's fantastic. We were staying in wonderful hotels. Everything seemed to work, and it was lovely. And I remember thinking, you filthy, filthy communists, none of you even ventured into the barrios where the poor live in that part of the world. None of you even spoke to the sort of people who are right now suffering under those regimes. And you do the same when you go to Cuba, and you do the same when you go to China. They don't look at the reality, or rather, they focus on the myths that conceal reality in their prospect of maintaining this fugazi that people like the Chinese and the Cubans and the Venezuelans are good for us when they're not.
Right. Now, I've got a question here from Mrs. Tukatela, who asks,
okay,
what does Big Daddy think about the Cuban doctors coming to help treat COVID patients here in South Africa?
Trash. I don't even need to hear the end of that to be able to give a solid opinion on this one. And again, I say opinion, but there's hard evidence behind this. The Cuban regime, that is, use these doctors basically as indentured labor. They're literally sending these doctors all over the world, mostly to poor countries that have a soft spot for socialism. And they're saying, hey guys, look at us. We are these wonderful internationalists. That's socialist ideology, the notion of internationalism. The idea, it's born out of the trade union movement. Again, I can't go into too much detail on this because it'll be another topic in itself. It's based on this notion, as I said, of internationalism, where there must be solidarity and we must help other nations around the world which are friendly to us. Now, that's the ruse. That's the appearance. Let me bring in Shakespeare here. All of Shakespeare's work hinged on the notion of appearances versus reality. Take Macbeth, for example, when Lady Macbeth in Act 4, was it Act 3, speaks about Macbeth having to be like the serpent beneath the flower. The serpent, the reality, the flower, the appearance. Appearances versus reality. Cuba is typecast in that regard. The appearance is, look at us, we're great, we train all these doctors, they're fantastic, they have a community outreach focus, take them. The reality is they're using these people as indentured servants because the vast majority of the salaries that those doctors are supposed to make go back to funding the communist regime in Cuba and gives them foreign reserves, foreign currency that they don't have. So as to them coming to treat South Africans, what a clown world. 23 of these doctors, upon landing, were found to have COVID themselves. So what? What exactly was the purpose of that? And what the purpose is more ideology and has nothing to do with COVID-19.
And South Africa spent 440 million rand on this total farce.
I don't know if that figure is verified. That's why I avoided it, but I can believe it. Maybe not the figure, but I can believe that we spent a lot of money to probably do this because we already spend a lot of money. Currently now via the Department of Health to send South African students to Cuba to study medicine. I don't get that. Like, why are we, it's not like we're a poor country. We literally could and should have been building greater capacity to train more doctors here at home, putting South Africans who want to study these studies, here at home to do that. And again, it didn't need the state to be the one that rolls out more medical schools. We could have literally just said, if you're a private medical insurer or a private hospital group, we're giving you a license to build a medical school. Period. Done. You'd have solved a lot of the problems of, for example, now what you're now seeing, and any medical student will tell you this. Because of the limited number of spaces for medical schools in South Africa, you now have a situation where they're applying race to weed out the race groups that they obviously see in their hierarchy of races as being undesirable. So white students can literally get 12 A's at matric, be outstanding achievers, fantastic, brilliant young people. But because of the limited space and therefore how the government wants to control this, they'll say, no. We have a gradient that we use based on race, and we'd rather get X percentage of black students in, X percentage of colored, X percentage of Indian, X percentage of white. And guess who's at the bottom of that totem pole?
Yeah.
Again, you can't run a modern, property-loving, free and prosperous society with asinine things like that. You can't do that. And this is the ideas that I push into the public of what you can and what you should and shouldn't do if you want to achieve that goal.
Let me tell you what really just exacerbates the situation here. There is something like, there's several hundred fully qualified doctors in South Africa of all races who've actually studied overseas, and they've come back to South Africa so that, and the reason they went overseas is just the point you raised now. They got all these A's, but they didn't make the grade, so they went and funded themselves in universities overseas. When they came back, the Health Professions Council of South Africa, or the HPCSA, changed all the rules so that they could not become doctors here. Now, you got these highly qualified doctors who could fill the gap. There's several hundred of them, and through red tape and bureaucracy, they've been prevented from practicing. It's just crazy.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Now, okay, let's continue. Property Power has asked. Okay, we got 6 more questions to go here, guys. Scott, can you ask Big Daddy if he thinks there's going to be anarchy in South Africa?
I don't understand the question. Anarchy in the ideological sense, which is akin to the logical conclusion of libertarianism, or anarchy as in just violence and
violence. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'll try and answer both. Okay. If it's the violence, I'll answer it that way. Short answer is we already have anarchy. There've been, again, remember I always say I cite data and evidence whenever I say something. In 2018, 2 steps back. Since 1994 in this country, there has been about a 500% rise in the number of service delivery protests in the country, and these protests are getting more violent in nature. Testament to that, maybe what was the crown of that stat was in 2018, I think. I stand corrected. I think it was 2018. In 2 places in this country, that demonstrated how the state can easily and quickly lose control of an angry mass of poorer individuals who are demanding a stake in the country's life and economy. In 2 places. One was Hermanus in the Western Cape, and the other was in Mafeking in the Northwest Province. I'll go through each in 30 seconds. In Hermanus, a community just outside of the urban center of Hermanus, a township there, were frustrated with service delivery, and in particular, their local councillors. So that uprising, the anarchy that came out of it, wasn't led by the EFF or the ANC, as a lot of people would assume the anarchy in South Africa would be led by. No, it wasn't. It was led by actual ordinary people who said, to hell with being treated like second-rate citizens, and to hell with these EFF and ANC councillors. The first people who were in the firing line of that angry grouping were the councillors, believe it or not, of the ANC and the EFF represent them. They burnt their houses down. Then they proceeded, of course, to go on a rampage, and it was massive news. And what made it scary for a lot of South Africans was not only how long it lasted, but that the police in Hermanus, South African Police Service, ran out of rubber bullets. Such is the corruption and the poor management that, things like police vehicles, public order policing equipment, and even rubber bullets for their shotguns, they ran out of and had to borrow them from the DA-run municipality in that part of the world. Not that I'm trying to pick the two, I'm trying to make an example here. That eventually got resolved by, I think provincial politicians going and calming the waters after, of course, the shenanigans of the ANC and the DA trying to outdo each other. Then I crossed over to Mafeking in the Northwest province, where this one was more party political as a faction of the ANC who was sick and tired of the then premier of that province, Supra Mahupapelo. Ooh, yikes. Literally went on a rampage, par nothing else. The whole city, or the whole town, city, I'm right, of that part of the world literally shut down, came to a standstill, where the police could not put a handle on the anarchy, if you will, of what happened in that part of the world. So to answer your question, yes, I think anarchy in that sense is possible, and you do see it flare up sporadically. I just don't think it will be organized on a national level, almost like the spring, the Arab Spring. I don't think South Africans, we're not that homogenous. I think it'll be issues based, and even though it'll be issues based, the state will have no handle on it, as we've already seen demonstrated historically.
Right. Now, Johan Hatting has asked, which party does Big Daddy think can rescue South Africa?
It's at this point that I issue a disclaimer and say I do not speak on behalf of any political party or even recommend or I really steer away from party politics. I fight for the ideas. But it's enough to say that perhaps in the last election, I did vote, and I voted for a party that literally said it'll put capitalism first and markets, place people and families first, devolve the power of the state, and place as much of the power into the hands of people. I'll leave it to you to guess what that party was.
I think I know which one you're talking about.
There was a hint in a video I did at the time.
Yeah.
I did a video of myself going to vote. You could also garner it from there. But those are the ideas, as I say, that I stand for. But I don't recommend any party, or just from my side. It's the ideas that I fight for.
Okay, now Francois Fantonda has asked, Big Daddy, what are your opinions on self-defense groups like Buralishion, etc.? I'm a fan and not a fan at the same time. I think, and this is the thing when I talk about responsible gun ownership, I don't think gun owners need to organize themselves necessarily. They may do it, they have the freedom to do it, but I don't think they need to organize themselves on ethnic lines or necessarily cultural lines or anything like that. Because I think the history of South Africa also teaches us that kind of stuff doesn't really end well. Take for instance, the ill-fated trip of the Avia Beer into what was then Bob. Just before, I think that experience showed a lot of Afrikaans-speaking South Africans that, absolutely fight for your cultural rights and fight for certain civil rights that should belong to everybody, like gun ownership and freedom of speech and blah, 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 but don't do it along the lines of groupings like that, because it can get lost in the messaging, and it can become about personalities more than what maybe historically what it was intended to be, which is to be cultural lines, whatever the case may be. And I'm not really answering that question because I have great difficulty with it, because I'm a gun nut. I'm a gun nut, but what I'm not is one who says responsible gun owners should be mandated, if you will, to organize themselves in those sort of groupings. That's not necessarily, that's not something I would stand for necessarily. But at the same time, if that's what you are about, hey man, all power to you. I'm not the kind of person who says, oh, it should never happen. No, of course not. But I think I would generally steer away from it. What I would want to see, if anything, is a broad coalition of South African gun owners saying, you know what,
I would defend you, whether you're black or white, because I know that gun rights are more important. That's the conversation we need to have here. Not that, gun rights in the context of this grouping or that grouping, even though you can delineate yourselves in that organically, but I don't think that should be the debate. Because, for example, one small example, I have a very big network of Zulu taxi bosses, to Zulu taxi friends. In fact, if you go to my channel and look for the Taxiland series, you'll kind of see what I'm talking about, where I talk about gun rights, and I say, it should be for everybody. And if it happens to be that, you're part of some cultural grouping and you exercise your gun rights in that way, okay, cool, fine. I'm just saying that shouldn't be the mandated rule of thumb, so to speak, of being a gun owner and doing self-defense in that context.
Right. Okay, now we got 3 questions to go, so I think we're going to make it.
Hey, we're increase here, man. We're getting these questions through.
Now, Ron Stone says, why is the outside world ignoring our plight? Why aren't people raising awareness to what this ANC is doing in South Africa?
Because, guys, we've got to remember that no one is going to come to save us. No one is going to come to save us. It is totally up to us as South Africans to not only get things right, but also create the sort of society that I argue we all kind of really want, right? Which is property earning free and prosperous. That's why I'm one of those people who doesn't look to the outside world in whatever iteration, even to societies that I'm quite warm and friendly to. I don't look to them to help or save us. What I do is I look to them as an example, and I said, this is what we should be striving for. For example, I'm a Zionist. I'm a big supporter of Israel. I believe Israel not only has a right to exist, but it is the Jewish people's state, and that everything it does at a governance level, insofar as it protects that Jewish state, it protects that state and the citizens of it, is something that we need to emulate as South Africans to a large extent. Not that we're a religious state or anything like that, and I'm not saying that's what Israel is. The point I'm making is, getting in place the right structures that even in a hostile part of the world, if they can get it right, in various things, by the way. I also have a series I did when I went to Israel, and I covered lots of issues from what Israelis think about Palestinians to the technology in that part of the world, especially around water, because it's 2/3 desert, but they have more water than we do here in South Africa. It's fantastic. To a whole litany of other issues. The point being, I think we South Africans should be learning from other countries, but that it's our duty, it's incumbent on us as citizens to fight for those values if we think they should apply to South Africa. And that's why I keep saying that it should transcend race, it should transcend cultural groupings. We actually need to look to each other as South Africans and say, hey, how do we do this? How do we get it right? I'm playing a part, right? I'm prosecuting the battle of ideas, traveling around the country, speaking to South Africans, mostly poor South Africans, and getting them on board with the ideas. But I need support. I need someone who says, look, maybe I can't do that, Big Daddy, because I have, maybe a family or whatever, but here, I'll support you, whether it's a financial support or whatever you feel like you can support the BBL movement with, then please do. But what I must impress in most South Africans is that it's up to us, guys. Like, we can't look to the rest of the world to save us.
Right. Now, Jack Spratt said, what about farm murders?
Yes, that is a massive problem. It is a massive problem, and I speak from personal experience in this one too. I mentioned to you that part of my background is also in rural parts of KZN.
Right.
So I know what it means to live in that sort of environment, far from anybody and everybody, including your neighbors. I mean, my nearest neighbor is about 6-7 kilometers away from me in that part of the world. I know what it means to live in that environment and to have a target on your back. It's absolutely appalling. And we've reached the point as South Africans where there is this weird insistence on trying to segment this issue to be a race one, whereas it isn't a race one. What it is an ideological one. It's literally a cast of politicians who are stoking a narrative about landowners. Because, by the way, it isn't just white farmers who are on the receiving end of this. If you are a prosperous you know, black agribusiness owner in an agricultural sense, you have a massive target on your back too. Massive target on your back, because the resentment being stoked by politicians is, how dare those established farmers, whether they're small scale or large scale, whether they're white or black, how dare they be prosperous on that stolen land. And if only we can just share that land and give everybody a hectare. Even though the reality, the practicality of that is just asinine, but anyway, a separate issue for another day. If we can just take away that land, primarily from the whites, yes. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that doesn't exist. They do racialize it, but it's more a socialist envy that they're pushing. The idea that those who are productive, those who are producing, those who are creating the employment in those parts of South Africa, where they would rather prefer a larger population of dependents in that part of the world, you, therefore, the productive one, are firmly in their sights. And I think there's now a organized and unorganized attempt at basically victimizing and killing off farmers in this country, black and white, which is the really lugubrious and insidious part of it, is that they don't really care about our race. What they care about is the fact that you're creating wealth in a part of the world that they don't want to see wealth being created. They need rural South Africa to be as poor as possible as a voting base and as dependent as possible on them as politicians. So on the issue of farm killings, I am one of the biggest supporters of our farming community, especially because I have family who farm, and it's an absolute scandal that you literally have no protection for the farming communities in this country. And it's partially why I'm a gun nut. I'm a gun advocate, because if the state is not going to protect you, then by God, you do it for yourself, and you band together as a community and you protect each other.
Right. Now, I find it quite extraordinary on this point that Cyril Ramaphosa made cattle auctions an essential service, while the garden services aren't. So I've seen fines of 10,000 rand people who are mowing someone's lawn as a garden service, but they're having cattle auctions, and one of those cattle auctions was Ramaphosa buying a bull for 500,000 rand.
There you go.
Now, I would be saying that where these guys who are doing farm attacks should be putting their attention is Ramaphosa's stock farms. I think that would be the perfect place for them to attack.
Look, I laugh, Riley, but at the same time I can't laugh at this because, I literally spoke to, maybe I shouldn't mention, but essentially beef farmers, and things are bad, man. Things are really bad. And, these guys are losing cattle in what's becoming organized syndicates now in those parts of the world. And again, when you then look at how politicians are oblivious to this, but when it comes to their own personal interests and their own, or rather the interests of their cronies, the guys, who they look after, different rules for them, different matrix for them. But for the rest of us who struggle on our small holdings, or even if you have a massive, agribusiness, and you're not yoked to the state, it's a different set of rules for us, man. That's why I keep saying South Africans need to look after themselves. We need to band together. We need to be able to say, listen, F the politicians, so to speak, screw the politicians. How are you and I band together, both in terms of making sure that both of our businesses thrive? Secondly, that we protect each other physically. Neighborhood watches, where we patrol our areas. I'm in strong favor of that kind of stuff, especially if the state is not going to play its role, which is to protect the rights of citizens.
Yeah. Okay. Final question. You've done really well, Big Daddy.
Cooking with grease, as I say.
Okay. Vincent Carrera has asked, what does Big Daddy think of the Ruperts?
Yeah. Entrepreneurial. One of the few families in this country which have built mega businesses that operate on a global sense. I mean, I'm a big fan of that. You've got to understand something about me. I'm not pro-business. I'm pro-markets. I'm pro-markets. There is a distinction because a lot of people, will ask me a question like, "Oh, what do you think about Rupert or Sol Kerzner? May rest in peace, or Motsepe, whatever." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's all fine and well, but I want to expand and extend that same climate, if you will, of entrepreneurship, building something which then becomes generational to all South Africans who have the acumen for that kind of thing." And that's why being pro-markets is more important than being pro-business, because business will always sort itself out, but markets always need the vigilance of a society to prevent politicians who want to pervert them and make them instruments of picking winners and losers based on race or whatever else. Massive respect for the Ruperts. I think they are some people who a lot of us can emulate if you're an entrepreneur. Because I'm an entrepreneur. I've got a small taxi business. And I would love to one day be a billionaire, who hires thousands of people. And, hey, who wouldn't want that?
Yeah, exactly.
But at the same time, I would advocate for the system that allows that, which is a free market capitalist system that allows people to be able to compete and create wealth.
Okay, now Gordon's asked a question about the quickest way to get a handgun legally at the moment. I think, Gordon, you're going to have to do your own research on that. I'll
tell you what. To be honest, Gordon, look up an organization called Gun Owners South Africa, GOSA, on Facebook. Talk to the guys there. Tim Flack is one of my good mates of mine. Sihle Ngobese is another guy. They can help you.
Okay, fantastic. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap up the live stream now because it's way after 11, or it's a few minutes after 11. I said that's the time we'd cut off. Before concluding, I just want to remind everybody that tomorrow night I'm talking to Joost Strydom, who's the head of the Orania movement, and we're going to be discussing the vision and the history of Orania, which is a fascinating story. And
absolutely,
don't forget, Saturday night at 8 p.m, we're going to have 3 top-class singers performing for us on a live stream. We're going to have Hanli Stelly, who is the blind wife of Alwyn Stelly. Beautiful voice. We're going to have our resident musician, Winston Coetzee, who wrote the Loving Life theme song, which you will hear at the beginning of this live stream. He's going to be performing, and we're going to have Melissa Smith performing as well. So that's Saturday night at 8 p.m. 3 top singers just here for your entertainment. We're going to have informal little chats between singers singing, so it's going to be a lovely evening. And certainly put in requests during that live stream, and we'll put them to them. Okay, now before I just finally address Big Daddy, I just want to say to my moderators, thanks guys, you've done a fantastic job as usual. It's been a really great live stream. We've gone for well over 3 hours, and most of that has been questions from people asking you stuff, which shows a level of interest that they have in what you're talking about. And I just want to thank everybody who's been watching this live stream, those who've been participating in the side chat. Thanks guys, you're what makes this happen. And all those who watch it later, please remember that this is real life in South Africa. And finally, and most importantly, I just want to turn my attention to Big Daddy. And before I thank him formally, is there a comment or a statement you would like to make to everybody who watches this video about something that you would like to share? I'll leave that with you for a second.
Guys, very simply, I'm on the ground fighting for what we really want as South Africans in this country. We all want to live in this country as a middle-income, wealthy, prosperous, property-earning and free society, but we've got to do the work. And you've got to support those of us who are doing the work. If you want to support Big Daddy Liberty, easy peasy, find me on Patreon and throw something towards the work that I do. If you can't do Patreon, if you're South African, then support the Institute of Race Relations by becoming a friend of the IRR. A simple 90 Rand a month we'll do it. And you can do that by SMSing your name to 32823. SMS will cost you R1. Terms and conditions to apply, but someone will give you a call and sign you up for a monthly debit order. But the simplest way is search Big Daddy Liberty on Patreon and get behind your favorite fat boy as I fight for a liberty-loving, prosperous, and free society.
I love that comment, fat boy. You know why? Because some of my older subscribers call me the old fart.
Hey man, I'm people's favorite fat boys. There it is. But thank you so much for having me.
And I think what Dave has said kind of sums up the mood and the side chat and the people watching. And he says, thanks very much for an awesome show. Big Daddy, you are a beauty of note to listen to. So there you go. You've got a huge number of fans here. Sihle, thank you so much for being part of our show. And I hope we'll have you on again later on this year, because there's so much more we could have talked about. I was thinking, just running out of time, all these questions coming through. So anyway, look, it's been fantastic. To everybody who's been watching tonight, look, please stay safe, please take care. Let's get South Africa out of the crap it's in under the ANC. I think that's a message we both have tonight, Sihle. And
absolutely.
So, all right, guys, I'm gonna sign off now. So, Big Daddy, Liberty.
Thank you very much.
He can go and get some